iPhone. Just this word alone immediately brings to mind an integral aspect of daily life that's permeated throughout society over nearly the past 2 decades. Everyone knows what an iPhone is. It's a smartphone, and generally speaking, about 50% of people tend to have one. If they don't, they have some other smartphone, an Android of some sort, potentially a Samsung most likely. They own a smartphone because everyone owns a smartphone, because smartphones are a necessity in modern society for better or for worse. We all need something that tethers us to this 24/7 connectivity to the internet, which has opened up communication in ways never even dreamed up before. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and today we're finally tackling a topic I've wanted to dig into for far too long. When did iPhone peak? We're gonna take our time with this to build our way to the eventual conclusion, but as a preamble, let's ascertain as to why this question might even crop up in the first place. Something as broad a subject as the quote-unquote peak of anything is gonna come purely down to subjectivity and the lens through which you judge it. For some, the question won't even exist because, of course, every year iPhone does improve, and whether that improvement is by a lot or by a little, there is improvement happening. And we'll delve further into this point of view later on. But for me, I think the question of when iPhone peaked arises due to a couple main factors. The first is simply iPhone fatigue. We get a new iPhone each and every year, specifically in the fall since the iPhone 4S. And with each new iPhone, the event gets less and less special by nature. Just as with getting older, time feels like it's speeding up because a singular year doesn't feel as long as it did previously. It's a smaller fraction. A single year is 1/24th of my life, but when I was 17, it was 1/17th of my life. With more and more individual iPhones, it does make sense they would get less and less exciting relatively as the total quantity increases. Now, this is a simplified reason for fatigue because iPhones aren't linear. Some models are going to be inherently more exciting than others, but it's at least part of the reason why I am no longer hyped or excited by new iPhones. It's not that I'm completely apathetic. I've based my main job for the past 7 years around Apple and generally reviewing iPhones in particular. I fell into this niche not necessarily intentionally, but it was born of passion for Apple products back when I was younger. I used to be the absolute definition of what you would consider a Apple sheep, somebody who thought Apple could do no wrong, and I was constantly hyped for whatever they were cooking up next, reading rumors and just immersing myself in that sort of culture. The new iPhone, the new MacBooks, and whatever else. Despite not being able to afford these products until YouTube took off, I was still so excited to see that new iPhone 5S, that new iPhone 6, 6S, and 7, and eventually after working over the summer, I got the iPhone 10 for myself right at launch, and it was like I finally had made it.
Hey guys, what's up? It's Josh from 91 Tech, and here it is. Finally, guys, I got the iPhone 10.
As much as it's easy to scoff at and be cynical regarding the consumerism on display here, you can see the genuine excitement on my face when I unboxed that iPhone 10. My instinct is to downplay it, to act cool like I was putting on a show for the camera, but I wasn't. I genuinely was absurdly hyped to finally be able to buy a brand new iPhone right when it launched, especially an iPhone that so radically shook up the experience. It was a source of pride to go through high school my senior year and have people ask about my iPhone 10 since they probably hadn't seen one yet, to show off something as simple as an emoji and see people smile even though it was dumb and silly. And that's okay. It's okay that I was this hyped about something so dumb and silly. It's okay that I was hyped about something from a, at the time, trillion-dollar company that didn't and still doesn't care 2 bits about me. And the purpose of this video is certainly not to put down anyone who still might feel the same way. Apple as a company has a certain allure to it that doesn't exist elsewhere. There's an air of exclusivity and innovation, no doubt spawning from their past in which they led the charge, typically with Steve Jobs at the helm, bringing mass technological revolutions with the Macintosh, the iPod, and of course the iPhone. That's a large part of the reason I personally fell in love with Apple, less as a company and more as a general niche. I loved jailbreaking, something Apple explicitly does not like. I loved the community, the history, and the hype that would build year after year in anticipation of the next time we would see just one more thing. But the iPhone, and similarly the iPad, is where those technological revolutions seem to die. Apple just hasn't done anything near the same level of innovation since. The Vision Pro is nothing really new. Google Glass was a thing well over a decade ago, and don't forget about the Microsoft HoloLens, even if neither of those products really went anywhere. The Vision Pro seems to be where everyone thinks tech is headed, but Apple used to be able to surprise us, to bring something new that, despite never prior existing, we would absolutely need. I can only hear Tim Cook claim that the iPhone being announced is the best iPhone they've ever made so many times before noticing my growing sense of stoicism. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, this isn't truly the best iPhone ever. Because the best iPhone ever would have more hype. It would change more, it would innovate more, it would bring features that would blow us away and set up iPhone for the future. It would get me excited, maybe not to the extent it used to, but I can't pretend to be thrilled just because Apple is now using titanium and they added an action button instead of a slider. It's not that I don't love my iPhone 15 Pro Max, I actually really do. And I have no doubt the 16 Pro will probably also be a fantastic phone. Every iPhone does in fact bring a new peak in a certain context, but it doesn't always invoke the same feeling of wonder and awe that a previous iPhone did. The same feeling that you're seeing something truly special. And 2024 might mark the first time in a very long time I did not buy the newest iPhone, because I'm not sure I want to. I do love my 15 Pro Max, so much that I could use it another year and probably not miss any of the supposedly new features that will inevitably come. When saying that past things are better than current things, nostalgia does play a part in this view. There's no denying that. And where iPhone peaked is going to potentially be far different for you than it is for me. But even so, there's a certain balance of what each iPhone brings to the table that at least gives us something to work with if we start by accepting the idea and notion that iPhone has indeed already peaked, despite the continual incremental improvements. To be the peak of iPhone, you need to consider the amount of innovation and upgrades in the phone, how many new precedents it set for future smartphones, how hyped and excited people were at the time, and how well the phone did, commercially as well as critically. These are all just some of the many factors that should be taken into account when proposing such a discussion. And so with that in mind, I ask that you humor me for the length of this video. Maybe go grab some popcorn, get comfortable, and let's embark on a journey exploring when exactly it was that Apple's iPhone peaked, along with how we got here in the first place. The first iPhone is a fascinating invention because practically everything that prevails throughout our current societal discourse and function spawns from it in some way. If you want to talk about something, you're probably doing it on the internet, and you're probably doing it on your smartphone. Specifically, what caused this was the iPhone in conjunction with the App Store, a hub that eventually allowed for every social media and route of communication to be doled out to the masses in a way streamlined and efficient. This has drastically morphed the way the world works, and namely communicates, allowing for real-time discourse on literally any event or topic of any category. While this existed before with the internet, it was never nearly as widespread or mainstream as it would become after iPhone. It also turned this 24/7 connectivity into not just a novelty or convenience, but an imperative and fundamental requisite to living our lives in a way that no one could have dreamed up prior to the monumental shift that occurred after that first iPhone became the catalyst for such immediate social reform. Think about it. While the internet as a whole is the backbone of all of this, try to think of any other new product that so quickly and vastly caused sweeping changes throughout the entire globe in such a short span of time. By the end of 2012, roughly 1 in 2 US adults already owned a smartphone, and that number, in my opinion, is probably conservative given the same statistics claim only 90% of people apparently own a smartphone as of 2023, though I suppose you do have to take into account seniors and the like. But the point here is within 5 years of the first iPhone's launch, the world had already changed irreversibly and irrevocably. Whether for the better or the worse is again debatable, but there's no question the world very well could be far different from how it is today had Steve Jobs and Apple never released the iPhone, had they instead just stuck with their music players and iPod, leaving cell phones to the Blackberries and Nokias of the world to continue innovation in a potentially completely different route. iPhone is a constant in our lives, whether we even own one or not. Every year, there's a new iPhone, and every year, there are incremental changes to smartphones that attempt to improve and build upon that original iPhone's foundation. Looking back at that first modern smartphone, it is incredible just how many aspects and innovations were established on that device and continue to be the way things are today on both iOS and Android. From things as simple as a digital keyboard and multi-touch display, to having a home screen act as a hub for your apps and utilities. Even autocorrect as a concept was there on the first iPhone, as it was a way to make up for the the lack of precision inherent with a digital keyboard rather than a physical one. A choice that was viciously divisive in 2007, but made a ton of sense as it allowed for content that didn't require the keyboard to have far more space to be displayed. It was also a decision that allowed for smartphones to take over our lives in such a dramatic fashion, with screens only getting larger and more immersive to even better display content and media as best as possible, both practically and intuitively. Even something as simple as using your finger to scroll and having momentum on the page with a little bounce when you reach the bottom is something so necessary in helping to build the entire experience. It's intuitive, it makes sense, and from this basic scroll functionality has come the core methodology of consuming most media as you scroll through pictures, news, posts, whatever else. What makes this first iPhone so great is not necessarily the product itself, at least from the lens of what makes a good smartphone in the first place. It did have a lot of issues that came with the good. There was no 3G networking, a basic feature that probably should have been there in 2007. The hardware could not keep up with the software after only a few years, and it only got a couple major updates as a result. The phone was expensive, with price cuts coming only months after launch, screwing over early adopters. As far as iPhone went as a product, it was not perfect, and in fact was far from it, but as a foundation and framework that would be used for every modern smartphone onwards from 2007 all the way to today, it was perfect. It provided a platform, a jumping off point for everything that has come since in the realm of tech. It has changed the world on an unprecedented scale, and it was iPhone that unlocked the true potential of the internet to become as compulsory and ubiquitous as it stands today. What iPhone did was create a new product category that merged the fringes of useful tech into one singular product. It was a phone. A cell phone was something most people had at this point, typically a flip phone or something like that. iPhone was also a music player, an iPod, something that was only exponentially growing and ironically would be killed by this product, as iPhone would end up replacing it altogether. What other company outside of a Steve Jobs run to Apple would dare to make a product that would not just eat into the sales of their main cash cow, but potentially make it redundant and obsolete altogether? While iPod certainly did retain major profitability after iPhone for the coming few years, it didn't last very long, with fewer and fewer models releasing, and even the ones that were consistently still coming out in the iPod Touch line was essentially just an iPhone without a SIM tray. While iPod continued to exist in a limited capacity, it was iPhone that took over everything for Apple and brought them to a level of popularity and eventually value that was unprecedented and virtually unimaginable. Apple's worth trillions of dollars today, not billions, trillions, because Steve Jobs made a huge risk in a product that could, and in fact did, ebb away sales from another risky product that first came out in 2001, a product that had literally saved the company from the edge of dissolution and transformed them from a niche computer manufacturer to eventually the monopoly they maintain today. But then there was the third aspect of iPhone, and that was the internet communicator. This was the true silver bullet in Apple's arsenal, and it was something they'd been setting up for years, with the iTunes store becoming huge and the main hub for music on the internet, single-handedly competing with piracy, as there had been so little alternative to it beforehand. In 2005, the iTunes store brought movies and TV shows, and so the foundation had already been laid for the Apple App Store to come in and only further their power of digital content distribution. There's only so much that can be said in regards to the innovation of the first iPhone, and none of this is new. We all know how much that single device changed the world, and even those who despise Apple and everything they've ever made or stood for should be able to admit that, objectively speaking, the first iPhone was the catalyst for modern smartphones as we think of them today. Smartphones built prior are so foreign that it's hard to even think of them as smart in any fashion. They just happen to have internet connectivity and thus technically fit the definition. All this is to establish that Apple's main goal and their bread and butter since that perfect foundation was set up is simply making more iPhones. That's what Apple does now, as they continually improve on that initial blueprint. 2008 brought 3G networking and a cheaper price tag. 2009 doubled the processing speeds. 2010 leapfrogged everything by adding so many features, like the Retina display, that far more premium design and build, Apple's first custom ARM-based chipset, a front-facing camera, and FaceTime. 2011 brought Siri, the first mainstream personal AI assistant that has led to this AI revolution we've seen, becoming even more and more relevant in recent years. 2012 brought finally a larger display and an even better and sleeker design. 2013 brought the first 64-bit chipset in a smartphone, as well as biometric security and a massive overhaul to the software in iOS 7. 2014 made iPhone larger and more immersive than ever before. core. 2015 improved on that experience. 2016 improved on that experience further, with dual cameras now and no headphone jack, because AirPods, which also would take over the world. And now it's 2017 and holy crap, it's the iPhone 10 that everyone calls the iPhone X, and the home button is gone and the screen is OLED and it's edge to edge, and it scans your face to unlock the device, which is straight out of sci-fi fantasy, and the jump 10 years down the road from iPhone is so ridiculously obvious now and amazing, and what we've got is so optimized and refined and robust and versatile and better than ever before. And then in 2018 we got the same thing with slightly better cameras and speeds. In 2019 we got another extra camera lens with a faster chipset. In 2020 we got a minor redesign harkening back to the iPhone 5 along with, you guessed it, slightly better camera and speeds. In 2021 we got slightly better camera and speeds, and in 2022 we got slightly better cameras and speeds, and wow guys, look, the notch is now just a pill-shaped cutout. Isn't that innovative? And now it's 2023 and look guys, we also got better cameras and speeds, now with titanium instead of stainless steel, because hey, we gotta change something. Plus also USB-C, because the EU forced Apple into adopting the same universal charging port that even Apple themselves had forced upon their own users with their MacBooks 7 years prior. You know, the MacBooks that only came with USB-C, and yet Apple stuck with Lightning on their iPhones for some reason. I suppose before answering the question of when iPhone peaked, it would be prudent to discuss whether or not iPhone has already peaked. Clearly, my answer is yes. Obviously, it has peaked at some point, but there's a very obvious rebuttal to this, and that's that every new iPhone that comes out is going to technically be better and faster and have more impressive photography than the phone prior. This is inevitable, and while some things like stainless steel to titanium do change seemingly purely for the sake of being different and thus new, the core of every new iPhone is going to have to be better than what came before it as a requirement and obligation. This goes for any recurring smartphone coming out year over year. Every Galaxy should be a bit better than the last Galaxy. Therefore, ultimately, until iPhone stops being made every single year and we have a final definitive version of it in some form, which will probably never happen, it will have never actually peaked. But this is a rather obtuse view of what peaking as a concept really is. A peak is defined as a highest point. So if you're peaking as a verb, you're reaching that highest point. What dictates what said highest point is completely dependent on the surrounding context and the lens we want to look at things through. But generally, if we're looking at a product that has recurring new models, then the peak can be considered to be when the product was at its most innovative or its best for its time, and that time period in which it came out has to be an inexcusable point of context for how we perceive these things. Otherwise, the newest thing is always going to be the peak of said thing. So, for example, what is the peak of Xbox? If you ask anybody who regularly games this question, they'll likely answer the 360 era. Would you want to solely play the Xbox 360 today? No, of course not. The Xbox Series X or a PC or PS5 or anything like that is going to be far preferable because technology has advanced significantly since then. But in terms of how we feel about Xbox, or how we feel about the direction it's gone, I think most would agree that the peak was the Xbox 360 era. Specifically, probably around when Halo 3 came out, which broke records for the biggest entertainment launch in history, and film execs actually blamed Halo for a 27% drop in box office revenue for that week. This could easily be considered about the peak of Xbox, but there's more aspects to this. If we really just look at like raw player numbers, technically 2021 saw Halo Infinite break player number records immediately when it dropped, but no one considers this the peak because the game at best was mediocre, and that is extremely generous even if it's gotten significantly better through updates in the years since, despite the feasibility of the user interface. Okay, my point in this tangent is that generally the peak of something in regards to how we feel about it doesn't typically align with what is simply objectively the technically superior product or device, or even just the best selling. Technology is still advancing every year. The problem is, phones have gotten so good these days that we've run out of a lot of headspace for smartphones to actually get much better in any facets that are obviously visible. The iPhone 14 Pro is identical to the iPhone 12 Pro cosmetically until you see the dynamic island, 120 Hz, and probably some other stuff. The 15 Pro does look a little bit different from the 14 Pro, barely, but you know, USB-C, and now it's titanium and stuff. The 16 Pro will look a little different, the 17 Pro will look a little different, but there's no need for drastic shifts in design anymore. These phones are already as efficient as they need to be in terms of providing a platform to access the content and media the internet distributes. It already takes photos that are more than good enough to capture moments and memories, and the same goes for an iPhone from 5 years ago, even 7 years ago. If you want to go even further, you can make the argument the iPhone 6 fundamentally is still perfectly good enough when it comes to the core of what a smartphone needs to be ability to deliver your desired content efficiently. The iPhone 6 itself isn't good enough, it's stuck on iOS 12 and suffers from bad battery life and is a decade old, so of course it's not good enough to actually use it these days, at least for the vast majority of people. But when you boil it down, the iPhone 6 is still strong enough of a template for Apple to still sell it, just in a slightly streamlined form. Specifically, the iPhone SE 3rd generation is just the iPhone 8 with a better chipset and otherwise the exact same hardware, and the iPhone 8 was just a slightly nicer iPhone 6 with more improvements that came with the better cameras and faster processing power, and of course the glass design. So with all that being said, does this make the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus the peak of iPhone? Well, if we go by sales, then actually yes, and it makes sense given the era in smartphones and the fast adoption and desire for phablet devices at the time. Phones that were larger than the traditional cell phone, which had actually only been getting smaller until smartphones took over. The first iPhone was pretty big physically compared to most flip phones and popular cell phones at the time, which was a hurdle they no doubt took into major consideration when settling on the 3.5-inch display. How large can we make this phone without scaring people away, since it needs to be at least a bit bigger than other phones to fit the digital keyboard. The physical keyboard could afford to be a bit smaller since physical buttons in conjunction with muscle memory would allow for a fair level of precision, but digitally, this was a much more difficult issue to tackle. Phones also were used for completely different things back then. They hadn't become media consumption devices like they would within only a half decade or so. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus came after years of Apple being surpassed by their Android contemporaries in size, with Samsung heading the charge in the Galaxy S and Note series of phones. We were at a point where there was now actual content we wanted to watch on our phones, consume on our phones, not just treating them as things that call people or text people, but instead something more akin to a traditional computer, and even main driver for accessing this media. The 3.5-inch display of the 4S, or even the 4 inches of the iPhone 5 and 5S, just wasn't cutting it anymore. Mind you, the iPhone 5 going to that 16:9 ratio was hugely important for how phones would only continually get taller. Today, the display on your phone is far more tall than it is wide, especially since those bezels are so drastically reduced. The iPhone 6 had answered the demand for a bigger iPhone. Not just a bigger smartphone, Android had you covered for that, but a bigger iPhone that ran iOS and everything that comes along with it. That's what people coveted, and finally Apple relented, causing the insane sales with about 220 million units shipped, placing the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus as far and away the best-selling smartphones of all time. By sales, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus are where iPhone peaked, at least when it comes to any individual model, because iPhone sales as a whole are still incredibly high, with 2021 actually claiming their peak total sales of 242 million units, so that covers every iPhone Apple was selling that year. While sales numbers are a justifiable category to judge the quality or supposed peak of a product, they don't tell the whole story by any means. I'd argue that by all accounts and purposes, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus were pretty weak iPhones in the grand scheme of things. Sure, the size was a major selling factor for them, and the new feature that people had demanded, but everything else about that phone just screams mediocre. The iPhone 5S had just had a big jump in the processing power, and thus, as you would probably expect, the iPhone 6 didn't really improve that much in that category, to the extent that the 5S also got updates to iOS 12 despite being a year older. Cameras didn't really change much. The design in hindsight to my eyes is actually a downgrade. It's pretty mediocre and one of Apple's worst. I really don't like those plastic antenna bands, albeit I'll admit I loved the design when the iPhone 6 first came out, no doubt in part because it was just new. It's like the gold color on the 5S. I thought it was the coolest thing a decade ago, but now gold has become probably my least favorite color option on the majority of iPhones released since. I'd also be remiss not to mention the whole Bendgate fiasco that overwhelmed the media noise surrounding the iPhone 6's launch, putting a blemish on what was otherwise an extraordinarily hyped and highly desired phone. It's easy to forget just how much attention and excitement typically surrounded a new iPhone's release each and every year. While this does still exist today, it's not nearly as relevant as it once was. We don't generally see huge lineups outside of the Apple Store for a day one launch anymore, especially in a post-2020 world. While there's a wide plethora of reviews and articles being pumped out before and after a new iPhone drops, the air of pensive anticipation for this brand new product just doesn't exist in any mainstream capacity like it did only a decade ago. When I bought my iPhone 15 Pro Max, the Apple Store was not over overflowing with customers, and there were not people camping outside for days at a time. While this no doubt in part was thanks to how Apple's gotten better with streamlining the pre-order process, the matter of fact is that your average person on the street just no longer really cares if a new iPhone is coming out. You don't see Samsung making commercials poking fun at the Apple fan mentality of lining up for the next iPhone, because that's not really a thing anymore. Not just because we don't need those lineups, but because a new iPhone launch has become so monotonous and standardized in this modern era of smartphones. It happens every single year, and there's no longer only a single iPhone releasing either, so you don't have hundreds of people in line all buying the exact same phone, thus splitting the shared experience that previously would occur. You can't talk with the person in front of you about how excited you are for these new Pro features when they're not buying the Pro model. I believe the disillusionment with hype surrounding the iPhone's yearly release probably began as a result of the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus coming out in 2014. For one thing, iPhone didn't change drastically in the years following. The bi-yearly trend of design shakeups no longer would exist moving forward. The iPhone 10 wasn't that far away, but the iPhone 7 is when Apple normally would have really shook up the design, and they didn't. But even with the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, as much hype as it did have, it was the 7th year of iPhone. It's something people were already beginning to take for granted, and justifiably so. Beyond just this, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus also had a lot of pushback with the Bentgate controversy, and this may have caused some pause to consumers who previously might have been inclined to buy the new device immediately on day one with future iPhone launches. Bentgate boiled down to the iPhone 6 using a weak grade of aluminum and being susceptible to bending, which would later lead to touch disease and a boatload of other issues. While this was not something necessarily unique to iPhone, as there were other smartphones that also bent fairly easily, the spotlight on iPhone in particular was so massive, especially with a phone as hyped as the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus, that it became an impossible issue to avoid seeing in the media at the time. The floodgates opened up after that unbox therapy video, and now the fact that the iPhone 6 and particularly the 6 Plus were bendable is the main thing people tend to remember about these phones. You could ask almost anyone on the street and they'll probably remember what Bendgate was in some form, or at least remember hearing about it. It was unavoidable, it was everywhere, it was a huge topic of discussion at the time. Apple's response to this did not help, giving only their generic corporate spiel about it not being a real issue and how their phones were very durable, and no one was actually experiencing real problems in normal use cases, which wasn't fully wrong, at least immediately, but it wasn't true as these phones were used for longer and longer periods of time and thus became more and more susceptible to touch disease. While there is no question Bendgate was far too overblown by nature of how much attention iPhone was getting around this time, not unlike how AntennaGate was made into a much grander issue than it ever deserved to be, the matter of fact is that the iPhone 6 was still not a well-built device when it came to basic durability, even just compared to previous iPhone models. In part, it's easy to understand that Apple may not have foreseen the difficulties that would arise with making larger phones, especially phones as thin as the iPhone 6 was, which was really impressive. It's still, to this day, the thinnest iPhone of all time, and that greater surface area caused the potential for more points of failure. The 6 Plus in particular was more likely to bend than the smaller iPhone 6, for an example. But as much as we could try to write all this off as just bad QA testing on Apple's part, it actually came out later Apple did in fact know the iPhone 6 was prone to bending before it even launched. Thanks to a 2016 class action lawsuit, internal testing documents were released exposing that Apple had described bending as expected behavior, and to me it speaks volumes of how Apple as a company treats its customers in the modern age versus how they previously did in the days of Steve Jobs. When AntennaGate hit, Jobs did an entire presentation explaining why the issue was happening, what was causing it, and he actually took some form of responsibility. In fairness, he does a lot of deflecting and says the media was blowing everything out of proportion, which they were, but they also show in that presentation how this was an issue with other phones if you held them in certain ways. And he is the CEO, of course he's going to defend his product. There's a few important takeaways, but one to me really stands out. For one thing, they did offer refunds to people experiencing issues. They also offered free bumper cases, which helped alleviate the problem, reducing the likelihood of the so-called death grip blocking your signal. But it also showed an acknowledgement of the situation and that Apple recognized it was an issue to begin with. They didn't pretend AntennaGate wasn't a real issue. They embraced it and tried to show people why it was happening, how to avoid it, and what they would do to make it right.
We're not perfect. We know that. You know that. And phones aren't perfect either. But we want to make all of our users happy. And if you don't know that about Apple, you don't know Apple.
Antennagate was not handled perfectly by any means, but it showed a very different Apple that was far more connected and engaged with their audience. Frankly, it showed Steve Jobs' Apple, as he did genuinely care, or at least appeared to genuinely care about the user experience, and didn't want to see anyone unhappy that had purchased a product from him. Jobs is a very unique sort of visionary. He's somebody who really did care about Apple and wanted his company to succeed. When he came back, he was taking a single dollar as a salary, so it was clear he wasn't just in all of this for the money. And that's something pretty unique from a CEO of any company, much less one of the biggest and most influential in the world. I'm not saying Tim Cook doesn't care about the customer experience, but there has been a pretty drastic shift in the Apple of old versus the current Apple, and I don't think many would disagree with me. There's also going to be a small subset of viewers who will believe you can't properly place the peak of iPhone anywhere outside the Steve Jobs era because of how radically Apple as a company did change. And while I do not agree with this, I do think it would have been very interesting to see the direction iPhone would have went under Jobs instead of Tim Cook and Johnny Ive. There was some good that came with the new leadership though, and that was Apple being more willing to experiment with iPhone as a whole. While this didn't always succeed, looking at the iPhone 5C, which we will discuss in a bit, iOS 7 was by all accounts and purposes a huge success and broke records for user adoption as everyone was more than ready for such a major redesign. I do love the old classic aesthetic of iOS. An iPhone 5 on iOS 6 is a gorgeous piece of tech, but iOS 7 did really usher in a new modern era that may not have happened under Jobs at all, at least for a while longer. I'm getting off topic, but my real point in all this was something we're going to continue bringing up when it comes to things like the fight against the right to repair. Apple as a company was not the same after Steve Jobs, and this has caused a bit of dissonance in public perception, as Apple doesn't appear to be as maybe friendly as they used to be. They're far more corporate, and while this may be somewhat inevitable given how Apple kept getting bigger and bigger to the point of being eventually the most valuable company in the world period, there is a lot of charm that was lost through the entire process in my eyes. This doesn't mean that iPhone peaked before the iPhone 6, but Apple as a company I think probably in fact did. But once again, I digress. The iPhone 6 and 6 Plus cannot be the peak of iPhone, if only for their faults, with bendgate and touch disease being a monumental problem made only worse by Apple's reaction and public statements following the media coverage storm. Blown out of proportion, sure, but where there's smoke, there's typically fire, and bendgate was no exception to this, even if the touch disease issues didn't become obvious until a couple years onwards from release. Beyond just bendgate though, even if we were to pretend it never happened like Apple would very much love to, I don't think it changes much in the grand scheme of things, as much as the iPhone 6 did set up a solid design framework for smartphones in the future, particularly prior to the iPhone 10. You can remove bendgate from the equation, but I still don't think the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus are the peak of iPhone. The iPhone 6 did bring NFC and of course Apple Pay, which was admittedly fantastic and has influenced greatly how we pay for things day to day a decade later. But beyond some small things, the iPhone 6 mainly just brought the bigger size to the table, which leaves it feeling lackluster to me and certainly not the peak of iPhone. And all this doesn't really answer the question of how we even constitute what the peak is in the first place. But I would assert that there's not really any easy answer to that question, aside from, similar to how most would no doubt feel like the Xbox 360 era was the peak of Xbox, it mainly just comes down to how we feel about something. The peak for me might be very drastically different from the peak in your eyes or in someone else's, because it's an inherently subjective concept. Subjective or not, however, we can at least still continue to discuss and hopefully narrow down where this elusive peak might align. And if we discuss purely just innovation and how much a phone does bring to the table, there's a few main iPhones that would cover this category. Most innovative phones off the top of my head are probably the first iPhone, the iPhone 4, the iPhone 5S, and the iPhone 10. There's no question the first iPhone is the most innovative of the bunch, but it'd be disingenuous of us to somehow claim that it was where Apple's iPhone peaked, as there was still much to be done in terms of needed continual improvement with new models. The first iPhone, as discussed, had tons of flaws that needed to be fixed. It certainly isn't where iPhone peaked, it's where iPhone started, which is commendable on its own. The iPhone 4 also brought a ton of stuff and was a huge leap forward, but it was also small and had Antennagate and was by no means the best iPhone, at least in terms of what Apple could potentially offer. The iPhone 5S, on the other hand, might fit the bill better. First, the big downside: the design was the same as the iPhone 5, gold color aside, but it still brought major technical innovations, along with, most importantly, the first major shakeup to how we actually use our devices. iOS 7 was a vast overhaul from iOS 6 in mainly design, but also functionality to a certain extent. While people were extremely excited for iOS 7 because it did look different, and that sentiment shouldn't be ignored when looking at things, the major improvements I think are more relevant is the addition of the draggable control center, as well as multitasking, along with biometric security and Touch ID. Now, technically a control center sort of existed in earlier iOS alongside multitasking. Double-click the home button and you would see all the app icons for apps that were open, and swiping to the far left gave some basic media controls for your music. But then with iOS 7, not only was the control center far more useful, with a plethora of media options and basic utilities like Wi-Fi, airplane mode, a flashlight, and so on, but you also had far better multitasking, which showed you a preview of the app page itself rather than just the icon. The actual experience of opening one of these apps hadn't changed significantly, but being able to see exactly what it was you were doing in this fashion paved the groundwork for the eventual gesture bar, current multitasking, and being able to switch app to app so seamlessly. And perhaps even bigger was that Touch ID fingerprint sensor, which removed the need to constantly be putting in your passcode, which was of course arduous and inconvenient. Now with the 5S, you could just put your thumb on the home button without any annoying interruption to verify it really is you using the device. And this was only the start of biometrics for iPhone. At this point, you barely glance at your phone and it just unlocks for you with Face ID. The iPhone 5S, like many of the iPhones we've been discussing, has a pretty fair claim to this elusive peak of iPhone, given how many precedents it set and the innovation brought to the table. Its longevity is also a clear indication of how well this phone was set up for the future, getting 6 years of major iOS support to iOS 12, the same quantity of updates that most iPhones have been receiving in recent years, plus a number of security updates that's prolonged its life even further. There are a few things, however, holding back the 5S for me when it comes to just saying it's the peak and calling it a day. There's no question it's one of the greatest smartphones ever made by any company. In fact, about 6 years ago now, I did a video trying to determine the best iPhone ever made, and the 5S ended up winning the battle royale of sorts as I went through each individual model and their merits. This wasn't just solely my opinion, but also that of a community poll I had held at the time, indicating this wasn't any sort of isolated or misguided notion. Whether or not I would still to this day consider the 5S the best iPhone ever made is a tough question to answer, and it's not the aim of this video to determine. The peak isn't necessarily going to align with what I think of as the best all-round iPhone in terms of an individual model. The 5S did a lot of good, but there's a reason we spent such a good chunk of time going over literally the next generation in the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. The fact that literally the next year's phone makes such a good argument puts a damper on the 5S's chances of being the peak. The increased size, while not something everybody wanted, was something the market at large ultimately did demand. This is more than made clear by those sales numbers, although the 5S is still one of the best-selling smartphones ever at just under 165 million units. When it came out, the 5S actually almost instantly became the best-selling smartphone, setting records left and right, and perhaps working against the idea that the bigger iPhone design was even as imperative as I've made it out to be. And this is a fair counterpoint. If we look at the iPhone 6 as mainly just a stretched-out iPhone 5S, the argument for the 5S being the peak becomes quite a bit stronger, as it did so many things that have even ensured its spot as the apparent best iPhone ever made, according to my own video in 2018. I know I'm kind of going back and forth here, but that's the thing about the 5S. It's small, but also it's kind of big in what it brought to the table. What works against the 5S is, for one, no unique design of its own. The iPhone 5 established its design the year prior, which itself was an evolution of the iPhone 4 design from 2010. The all-in-one seamless aluminum body was amazing. The glass antenna bands just screamed premium, and it was so good, Apple would end up basically going back to it with the iPhone 12 line in 2020, just with a glass back for the sake of wireless charging. And what we have today is still very similar. The 5S did bring the gold color, however, which is a more consequential shift than you would first expect. It was the first time Apple had ever had more than just white and black as color options on iPhone, and it was a genuinely big reason people were so hyped for the 5S when it came out. Now, just because the 5S wasn't the first to use this general design doesn't mean it should be penalized, but it does take some of the wind from its sails in my eyes, no matter which way we try to twist it. Whichever way we toss it, there's no question the 5S is one of the greatest iPhones of all time, if not the greatest. The design was technically redundant, but it was still fantastic. The gold color and iOS 7 added to the iPhone experience in a way that had not existed prior, setting the stage for future devices to further this evolution. Touch ID the biometrics brought a level of convenience we'd never had beforehand. Then you've got the first 64-bit smartphone chipset ever in the A7, which allowed for 6 years of software support, along with somehow actually solid performance on its final iOS version in iOS 12. It's crucial to emphasize just how big a deal this genuinely was. iPhones prior to this point had, for the most part, done really poorly with later iOS updates due to poor optimization in conjunction with hardware limitations. The 5S, with its relatively advanced processing capabilities, opened the doors to further longevity. The first and second iPhones both struggled on their final versions, which is understandable given their woefully underpowered specs by nature of being such early mobile devices. The iPhone 3GS actually performs shockingly well on iOS 6, which is no doubt in part thanks to how lightweight the software was. The iPhone 4 got iOS 7, which was really quite slow, especially when the update first dropped, but at least usable. The 4S then not only got iOS 8, which was already chugging, but then also iOS 9, which is without a doubt one of the worst decisions I would argue Apple has ever made, devastating the 4S and other devices featuring the A5 chip that also got the update. Luckily, the iPhone 5 on iOS 10 was not too bad, and then the 5S got iOS 11, the first version of software to run solely on 64-bit devices, but iOS 11 itself was a bit of a buggy mess, which will come up again in this video a bit later on. But then Apple did something practically unprecedented. They actually improved the performance and experience on older iPhones with 2018's iOS 12 that came to both the iPhone 6 and the iPhone 5S. I cannot think of many other times Apple has shown off during a presentation that their new version of iOS benefits their older devices. iOS 12 was fantastic for this, and since this point we've had solid performance on any iPhone running its final version of iOS, which is one thing I think we can all agree modern Apple has really handled well. The 5S was the turning point for this, and that's something I did want to give some very justified credit to. And in the iPhones that have since then been retired for updates, we've seen this trend continue. Heck, by now we've got half a decade of iPhones that have lost iOS support since the 5S as data points. We'll get to the 6S in a bit, which did get a stunning 7 years, but I can't emphasize enough how crazy it is a 2013 device was still receiving security updates as recent as 2023. That's unheard of for a smartphone. For every single amazing facet of the iPhone 5S, for everything it brought, for as much as I've been hyping it up, we cannot call it the peak of iPhone, and the reason isn't because of the 5S itself, but instead it's because of its counterpart, a phone that we cannot, for the purpose of this video, separate from the 5S in order to be as fair as possible. The 5S almost would be the peak of iPhone. In the very least, it would definitely be one of the top contenders. But we have to talk about one of Apple's biggest failures of its modern era, the iPhone 5C. As a former owner of the iPhone 5C, I actually loved that phone. It was the first iPhone I saved up for and personally bought myself off of eBay in 2014 used, and it was actually a pretty great experience. The phone itself was in fact pretty great, but the problem is it was pretty great because the iPhone 5 was amazing, and the 5C was just the iPhone 5 but a year later and thrown into a colorful plastic shell. While the 5S on its own in a vacuum is one of the best iPhones ever made, we can't judge it in that context like we could in that previous video 6 years ago. We're talking about when iPhone peaked as a whole, and as such, if we have another iPhone launched at the same time, it's going to be inexorably linked. You cannot talk about the 5S without talking about the 5C, and this rule will apply when it comes to later iPhones that also saw dual releases. I'm not going to take too much time on the iPhone 5C since this video is inevitably already getting far longer than I ever intended. You know, one day I'm just going to make a video I plan to be about 15 minutes, actually only 15 minutes long. Today is not that day. Oh well. The problem with the 5C is again not that it was ever a bad phone, it was just pathetically terrible value. It was only $100 less than the 5S, and every single positive aspect we've mentioned with the 5S, strip it away from the 5C. It was the iPhone 5 in plastic. Yes, it brought some colors, something Apple would revisit with the iPhone XR 5 years later, and so that's cool, but the polycarbonate made the phone feel cheaper, something that would have been fine had it been priced congruently with that impression. Don't forget, to this point, Apple wouldn't just discontinue iPhones only a year after releasing them. These days, the newest Pro iPhone just replaces the previous one. But this was the first time this happened, in 2013 with the 5S and the 5C. Normally at the time, the iPhone 5 would have stuck around and seen probably a $100 hit in the price tag, making it a slightly more budget-oriented but still solid option alongside the 5S. But instead, Apple replaced it at the same price point the 5 should have been, but with the 5C, the same phone, but plastic. It was a somewhat odd ominous sign of what was to come, with Apple taking more and more aggressive measures to offset cost onto the consumer. But this was much more blatant and egregious than we'd seen to that point, and honestly, even since then for the most part. I think the 3rd gen iPhone SE at $430 in 2024 has far surpassed the 5C in terms of abhorrent value, but I've done a video on that subject before, so we'll just leave it lie there. The point in all this is the 5C was just a straight up bad deal. Had it been even $150 less than the 5S rather than only $100 less, there'd be at least some justification, but it wasn't. It only got to iOS 10 to boot. The 5C was poor value, and it unfortunately puts a huge blemish on that 2013 iPhone lineup, making the 5S and 5C certainly not the peak of Apple's iPhone, at least to my own examination. So let's move onwards here to the iPhone 6S and 6S Plus. This is where iPhone models were beginning their slowdown in obvious visible changes year to year, though not so much with this model in particular. An S model retaining the same design as the year before was already the norm in iPhone's pattern, so the obvious issues wouldn't really appear until the next year's iPhone 7 and 7 Plus didn't drastically change that design. The 6S was actually the final really good S upgrade, helped in part by being the second to last S model Apple would ever make. The iPhone XS being the final one in 2018, before Apple moved to their current Pro naming scheme and dropped it altogether. I can't blame them for that, because the S moniker always implied that there was a 2-year turnover in iPhone design and big changes, something that just isn't true anymore. Apple would make a big splash with an iPhone that changed up the experience, and then the next year's iPhone would smooth out the edges and bring much needed adjustments where necessary. The iPhone 3GS literally doubled the speeds of the 3G, as mentioned. The iPhone 4S fixed antenna gain, added Siri, and substantially improved the hardware and photography. The iPhone 5S brought everything we just talked about. The iPhone 6S also would do a lot to better that iPhone 6 design. The A9 chipset was far faster, and doubling the RAM to 2GB was much needed. The 6S fixed bend gate and touch disease by being one of the most durable iPhones ever made with a higher grade aluminum. This I don't consider to be the biggest positive, because bend gate never should have happened in the first place, and fixing that sort of design flaw should have been a given with the next model regardless, but even so, the 6S is very impressive in terms of durability, outdoing the iPhone 7, and because iPhone moved back to the glass back with the iPhone 8 and onwards, it's unlikely we'll ever see a phone quite as durable as the aluminum 6S ever again. We got the rose gold color, which is something a lot of people were very excited to see. Another cool thing was something Apple didn't even advertise, but they actually added minor water resistance by sealing the phone with adhesive, something that's a bit of a double-edged sword since it does reduce ease of repairability, but it was overall a positive moving forward. Actually, Apple's fight against the right to repair is worth mentioning, as it would only get worse as the Tim Cook era of iPhone progressed. Prior to the 6S, iPhones were actually still fairly straightforward to open up and fix, and honestly the 6S wasn't that bad either, you just needed to heat up the adhesive. I'm not going to spend too much time on this sort of thing because it's all kind of negative anyways, but repairability also isn't a major factor to the vast majority of Apple's user base. It is worth mentioning, I think it's a real pity how hard iPhones would quickly become to fix, and how Apple's done everything in their power to monopolize repairs, so you have to go through them instead of a third party, but I digress. Back to the 6S. 3D Touch was an exceptional addition that added a whole new layer to how interacting with your phone could work, something that despite its potential, Apple unfortunately would squander by never doing anything with it in future iOS updates, to the point that they just dropped 3D Touch after the 10S. It sucks because it's a feature that could have become a mainstay in smartphones moving forward had they actually tried to do something with it, but instead I think they just never had any idea of how it could be utilized and implemented past the same things we do now with just long presses on current iPhones. It's a pity, but that's just how it goes, so as great as 3D Touch was, it's not as big a positive with the 6S as it should have ended up being. The cameras on the 6S and 6S Plus also brought significant upgrades, upping the megapixel count from 8 to 12, and also adding 4K video recording. There's also second generation Touch ID here, which made the fingerprint sensor far faster and more consistent. Not that it was bad on the 5S and 6, but it's now even better. The iPhone 6S was at its core a really strong iPhone, despite not doing anything as pronounced as changing the design. It was truly the perfect S upgrade, and it got 7 years of iOS support all the way to iOS 15. As of 2024, it's still getting the occasional security update, which is exceptionally impressive. I think the case for the 6S being the peak would actually get stronger if we threw in the first generation iPhone SE, which would come out March 2016 and was essentially the 6S in the shell of the 5S. There were only a few notable features that did not carry over from the iPhone 6S to the iPhone SE, but none were significant enough to detract from the quality of the smaller phone, especially at its almost surprisingly generous starting price of $400 without a contract. Keep in mind the iPhone 6S would start at $650, making the SE just 60% of the total cost. What you were losing out on in exchange for saving that $250 amounted to the larger display and newer design, second generation Touch ID, 3D Touch, and the 5-megapixel selfie camera in favor of the older 1.2 megapixel sensor, and that is it. No, really, those are the only noteworthy exclusions from the iPhone 6S to the SE. The SE would have the same A9 chipset and performance, even getting to iOS 15 just the same as the 6S. You had the exact same 12-megapixel rear camera capable of 4K video, and even the rose gold color made an appearance. While the battery of the SE is ever so slightly smaller than the 6S, the actual battery life would end up even better according to Apple's own website. We're talking up to 13 hours of video playback versus 11 hours on the 6S, an actually impressive jump all things considered. It's thanks to the smaller, older display that pushes less pixels and thus requires less power. The 6S Plus did manage 14 hours, of course, but that is a far larger phone physically speaking. If the newer, flashier gimmicks of the 6S did not appeal to you, or they were something you could live without, there was nearly no downside to going with the iPhone SE instead. It was so absurdly good value that it's almost unbelievable it was from the same company that had pushed the iPhone 5C not even 3 years beforehand. The SE is probably one of the greatest iPhones ever made, not only by merit of the value proposition, but also just the entire scenario in and of itself. It showed a rare case where Apple was actually willing to listen to consumers, and were conscious of portions of their user base still unwilling in 2016 to move on to a smartphone with a larger display. The iPhone 5S at this point was still going strong, but it was over 2 years old, and there was an absolutely not inconsequential number of users with older iPhones that felt left behind by the much newer, much larger devices, especially after years of Apple maintaining the ideal that a phone should be usable with one hand. The SE not only appealed to the mid-range and budget markets, but also a niche subset of smartphone users every other company had forgotten about. And Apple did this all with a device that, unlike the third generation iPhone SE, wasn't half-assed, but a proper, genuinely modern and impressive flagship that could compete with any of the best phones out there. For a beautiful, shining moment, Apple sold one of the most reasonable and consumer-friendly smartphones ever made, and it's a true shame we still cannot say the same today. In any case, the iPhone SE was amazing, and the 6S and 6S Plus were already pretty great as well. But there is more to discuss here. The combination of these two phones together made for one of the best overall iPhone lineups I think Apple's ever had, but it's still held back by a couple sticking points that leaves it as just not really the peak of iPhone for me, such as perhaps most conspicuously, the starting storage option of only 16 gigabytes. This is a problem for a few main reasons. For some context, the first iPhone would end up having a 16 gigabyte option during its short life, and that model was released February 2008. In 2015, Apple was presenting their main flagship option with a starting storage size of the same number, which was already, at the time, pitifully small and just not good enough for users who bought it. Yeah, they might have been okay for a while, but eventually that storage would fill up, and if you've ever had an iPhone that's nearly full on storage, you'll know that the experience can tend to slow down and quickly become a huge pain to deal with. I could sort of forgive the 2016 iPhone SE for starting at 16 gigabytes, given it was a more budget-oriented smartphone. I don't like it, but I could live with it. That being said, I cannot and will not forgive the 6S for starting at 16 gigs, for the reason that the lowest storage variation is the model the majority of users are going to end up buying and thus be stuck with moving forward. They think they're purchasing the newest, most premium flagship Apple sells at the time, and as such basically the best or of the best smartphones on the market. But in buying that low storage size at 16 gigs, they unwittingly become shackled to too little storage space for them to properly and fully enjoy that experience. Most people keep their phone iPhone for at least 2 years. That's a standard contract anyways. They might be fine for a time, but eventually that low amount of storage that's already partially eaten up by the ever-expanding operating system is going to hinder the functionality in a way painfully obvious and disruptive. There's nothing more dreaded than the infamous pop-up telling you your iPhone is running low on storage space. The next year with the iPhone 7's launch, the SE and 6S both saw their entry-level models get bumps up to 32 gigabytes, which shows Apple ended up recognizing it was an issue, but they very much should have seen it coming, and they probably did. They've got this weird obsession with giving customers so little storage at their base models of devices. It's always rubbed me the wrong way, whether we're talking iPhone, iPad, or very egregiously often MacBooks. It's not so much an issue today as it used to be. 64 gigs on, say, the 3rd gen SE is probably good enough for the users that are buying the SE, but either way, 16 gigs in 2015 was just a pathetic number, and I did want to ensure we covered just how much of a cheap and ridiculous move this was on Apple's part. It is an unfortunate reality of modern Apple. There's seemingly always a catch with their devices, something that removes a lot of the good they tend to bring. The iPhone 7 started at 32 gigs, and the 2017 iPhone 8 and iPhone 10 all started at 64 gigs. Within 2 years, they went from 16 gigs to 64, because Apple realized how little storage space it was. Modern Apple. Right to repair is an easy issue to point to, but it's just kind of how things are, and you either have to accept it or buy from some other company to begin with. If you're entrenched into the Apple ecosystem, however, as many users are, then you might feel kind of stuck, and there's no easy answer here. I do still personally prefer iPhones despite some limitations Apple tends to impose, but it is crucial to emphasize they've never released a perfect product. Nobody has ever released a perfect product, not truly. iPhone has done a lot of good, but there's most certainly some bad too with each and every model, and taking accountability for their flaws is unfortunately not something Apple's ever been prudent with. But let's continue moving onward. The iPhone 6S and 6S Plus are indeed high points overall in the history of iPhone, as is the first iPhone SE, but none of them amount to the peak. They were genuinely substantial increments upon the groundwork of the previous iPhones, which is very respectable, but that's ultimately all they were. Don't get me wrong, I'd be bouncing off the walls with excitement if any modern iPhone had even half the amount of improvements the 6S brought over the 6, and it definitely fares better than the next year's iPhone 7 and 7 Plus. I'm going to kind of gloss over these devices because I think it's pretty clear they're nowhere near the peak. They're actually one of the first times I can comfortably say they were a pretty low tier iPhone upgrade. Not 5C level, but also not good. The second camera lens on the 7 Plus exclusively was admittedly an awesome addition and one that did establish a new precedent for smartphones moving forward. And there were some other minor things, like the front firing speaker, IP67 water resistance, the capacitive home button. The color options on the 7 and 7 Plus are also noteworthy, with some of the best options we've ever had. The matte black and jet black are fantastic, with the jet black in particular having this really unique glossy finish despite still being aluminum. There was also a product red edition, which is something we've still never seen again on Apple's foremost flagship iPhones, only their non-Pro variants, so that's kind of cool. The design did clean up the iPhone 6's antenna bands, which is nice, and this was most definitely just a stopgap iPhone, and in my opinion probably less significant an upgrade than the 6S despite not being an S model. It's essentially just the iPhone 6SS. And of course, we can't talk about the iPhone 7 without at least mentioning the headphone jack issue. Yeah, they removed it in order to sell AirPods, which in fairness are awesome, but this was still a strictly anti-consumer move. There's no question about it, the iPhone 7 is, if anything, a very low point for iPhone's history, even if it did bring some meaningful change along with it. It's the next year's iPhones where things really start to pick up, and it's finally almost time we get to talk about one of the most innovative iPhones ever made, the iPhone X. But first, we do have that iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, which adds a bit of a wrench in how we examine that 2017 lineup in terms of approaching iPhone's peak as a whole. Coming into this video, I expected to end up saying the iPhone X is iPhone at its peak, but given how we've been approaching this, combining it with the 8 and 8 Plus could somewhat complicate things. Now that being said, I'm not so sure it's actually any kind of downside. If anything, it might make things even better, as not everyone was ready for, nor particularly wanted, the new design and the lack of home button that came with the very expensive 10th anniversary iPhone. The 8 and 8 Plus on their own are basically the iPhone 6S SS, with even less significant upgrades than the iPhone 7, making the back glass instead of aluminum for the sake of wireless charging, and adding the most minor of incremental changes on top of that. But this was okay because they weren't the point of interest for iPhone in 2017. They were essentially the non-pro variants. This was like the first time Apple had done that. What everyone focused on came down to one more thing.
The first iPhone revolutionized a decade of technology and changed the world in the process. Now, 10 years later, it is only fitting that we are here in this place on this day to reveal a product that will set the path for technology for the next decade.
On stage at the Steve Jobs Theater, September 2017, Tim Cook boldly proclaimed as he introduced the iPhone X that it would set the path for technology for the next decade. And it appears he was correct. What we're now approaching is probably the strongest case for the peak of iPhone that we've discussed thus far. I purposely glossed over the first 5 years of iPhone because there were a lot of basic things that still needed to be improved upon with those phones. The iPhone 4 did innovate a crazy amount and was tremendously consequential in orienting how smartphones were made moving forward. It was arguably the first truly premium smartphone, propelling iPhone as a luxury experience and separating them from the up-and-coming, rapidly improving Android competition. There was still much to be done, however, in refining what a smartphone could and would later truly become, which was a platform for delivering content, as we discussed much earlier in this video. The 16:9 ratio with the iPhone 5 helped immensely with that, as did the increased display size in the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. These phones were all pivotal steps in their own right. And the iPhone X was the result of 10 years of this, finally introducing the current modern smartphone experience that we still utilize 7 years later. From the very beginning of iPhone, the home button had always been the cornerstone of the iOS experience. It grounded the device and made it exceedingly intuitive, giving users a straightforward path back to the home screen and familiar grid layout that acted as a hub for every application. Eventually, it would receive even more functionality with multitasking via a double click, presenting an overhead view of all of your app windows to maneuver through and force quit if you so desired. While the home button was practical, it also presented an inevitable conundrum as smartphones progressed and improved over time. iOS had been reliant on this physical button that invariably held physical space below the display, forcing limitations in how Apple designed their phones from the front. They couldn't simply remove the bezel and home button and just make the screen edge to edge without some sort of replacement for this pillar of navigation between the apps we use and the hub in which to find them with the home screen. So what's the solution here? Well, we already know what Apple did, but before the iPhone X was announced, there was plenty of speculation on what their solution would entail. One option was to move the Touch ID sensor to the back of the phone, much like LG phones from this era, the Google Pixel, and then you could potentially have something like most Android devices utilized, with a navigation bar on the bottom of the screen, so a digital home button. Face ID was a really good example of a feature Apple brought that nobody had really imagined outside of some leaks and rumors not long prior to the iPhone X's unveiling. There had been somewhat similar biometric methods on other smartphones. Samsung had iris scanning, for example, but these tended to be either insecure or very slow. There hadn't been any ideal middle ground to this point. Fingerprint sensors, ever since the iPhone 5S, had proved to be the best, the most efficient method of getting into your device, and even today they're still very common, often under the display of the phone rather than any physical button. That idea had been rumored as a potential solution, but this was always fairly ambitious as that tech really wasn't too viable yet in 2017. You could stick the fingerprint sensor in the power button, potentially, but the most common rumor and concept, at least earlier in 2017, was this: an iPhone with the Touch ID sensor on the back. Firstly, can we just take a moment to thank Apple for not actually going through with this? I really don't know how they could make this design look good, not while retaining the Apple logo, but putting that sensor on the back would be Samsung's own solution with the Galaxy S8, a phone that came out early 2017 and technically beat Apple to the punch when it came to dropping the physical home button and reducing bezels, though they retained some bezel on the top and bottom. They switched to a similar navigation bar to many other Androids and put the fingerprint sensor on the back beside the camera, a bad spot that was awkward to reach with your finger. You would often just touch the camera sensor instead. It was one of the worst designed aspects of the phone, and thankfully they did fix it in the next year's Galaxy S9. So that was Samsung's solution. Not ideal, but it did work, and they also had iris scanning if you preferred that, which was slow. For a long while, it seems like Apple was going to go the same route. There were pictures of supposed iPhone shells, including the cutout for Touch ID on the back. I wouldn't be surprised if Apple had been in fact experimenting with this form factor, if only to throw leakers off the trail for what they would ultimately do. Leakers also weren't sure just how far Apple would go in making their edge-to-edge Super Retina display, with, as an example, this leak hitting the news as late as June 2017, showing an iPhone with a rectangular display, no home button, and bezel similar to like an LG G6. There was a lot of confusion and skepticism as to what Apple would do for their iPhone 8's design. And yeah, a lot of people called it the 8 at this point. We didn't know it would be the 10, but all these leaks being shared really did look convincing, and there's a pretty good chance Apple, again, purposely threw them out there themselves to throw everyone off the trail. It's that sort of fun, harmless misinformation that ultimately brings a lot more hype and excitement when it comes to the real reveal. The mystery element, especially when the device is even better than initially imagined, really lends to the gravity of the unveiling. The crowd goes wild in the keynote for the iPhone 10, and it makes me sort of sad Apple no longer does these live presentations anymore. But enough of the concepts. We know what Apple ended up doing, which was Face ID. It scanned your face, was fast and secure, and ultimately worked incredibly well, only improving over the years with updates and newer iPhones. Apple could safely get rid of Touch ID altogether and replace the home button functionality with the gesture bar. Gestures were and still are awesome, and it's amazing just how intuitive they managed to be for even new users fairly unfamiliar with technology. I've had to help a lot of seniors and older people over the years who really don't know anything about smartphones eventually upgrade from their older iPhones to a new one, and while they're always pensive about the learning curve with no longer having the home button, there's not one person who didn't quickly and readily understand and latch onto the new gesture navigation. That to me is a good sign of intuitive design.
Try again.
What the heck?
All the way from...
I am.
Drag it. There you go. There you go. Now swipe through them. Open the calculator. Start typing 91. Good boy.
Swiping up to go home is simple to remember and makes sense, and what I really love about this system is how iOS developed such a beautiful flow to how it worked. iOS 7 back in 2013 was a very popular update, but also a bit of a mess for a multitude of reasons. If you find an old iPhone on one of the early versions of iOS 7, not one of the later updated versions, you'll see just how slow and almost painful all the animations are. Apple put a lot of time into making everything about the software beautiful, but in doing so they had reduced a lot of the speed and practicality of their previous software. With time and updates, animations were sped up quite a bit, and everything as a whole got much better and more fluid, and by the time the iPhone 10 rolled around, iOS was suddenly brought to the next level. Beyond just swiping up to go home, you could now also swipe up and hold to get some multitasking, or swipe up and to the right, which was a little quicker. You could also swipe to the side to move to recently used apps. Those app windows were now an ever-present part of the experience that could be dragged back into view at will. This smooth flow was just so satisfying and an absolute joy to use. Mind you, iOS 11 was a bit of a buggy mess when it came out, and that did hinder things a bit. I myself back in the day didn't have too much trouble that I can recall, but I do remember bugs and hiccups being fairly frequent occurrences in the early months of using the iPhone 10, and we'll discuss shortly why in part I think this ended up all happening. But taking a step back here, not only had Apple made a phone that looked aesthetically far better than many rumors had predicted, but they also had circumvented the need for Touch ID by replacing it with something equally great, if not superior. Now personally, I've always preferred Face ID, but opinions are gonna differ and that's fine. Either way, it was a clean, brilliant solution, one nobody had really expected, and the type of thing you would, funnily enough, expect the old Apple to do. To introduce something no one had done before in that way, and not even remotely close to as well implemented. However, there is another quandary that arises. The home button was perhaps the most iconic design element of any iPhone. Of course, beyond the Apple logo on the back of the device. It again grounded every single new smartphone Apple made and kept them recognizable as just that, an Apple iPhone. To remove something so imperative to the brand image would leave a gaping hole in the identity of their new device, unless of course they had a replacement for it, something that could be also nearly just as recognizable, something someone could perhaps shave into their forehead, as any true Apple sheep would. The notch was always a controversial element of the device, but one that I also think was a brilliant move. When you think notch, you think of iPhone, or Minecraft, but when you think of like a phone notch, you think of iPhone. It became a part of your phone's identity, an element that was not a hindrance, but simply a part of its design and its aesthetic. In contradistinction to this, 2018 saw Google releasing their Pixel 3 and Pixel 3 XL, the latter of which had possibly the ugliest notch of all time, which was unsurprisingly and ruthlessly memed on immediately. Google Google missed the point with that phone. First off, they had a huge thick chin, something Apple had managed to avoid outright. Their notch was also poorly implemented, being not as wide but much taller, thus cutting further into the display itself and more importantly the content. iOS was perfectly set up to incorporate a black bar at the top, putting the time and signal information in the corners. The implementation itself wasn't perfect, especially when initially Apple didn't have any option to see your battery percentage, which was always absurd, but the notch inevitably ended up blending into the experience so quickly you could practically forget it was there altogether. As said at the beginning of this video, I bought the iPhone 10, and right off the bat, being very much excited for the phone, I personally didn't mind the notch at all. I thought it was cool if anything, especially combined with the rest of the device and the edge-to-edge display. In hindsight, the popular concept of the iPhone 10 where the notch was just filled in altogether looks off, and I don't think many will disagree with me. We all got used to the notch because Apple wasn't ashamed of it, but made it a core tenet of their flagship's identity. All the marketing for the iPhone 10 has the notch extremely obvious and boldly proclaimed within their images. Actually, compare that to the iPhone XS the next year, where Apple specifically chose a wallpaper where the notch wasn't visible. I always thought that was an interesting move on their part, and they did the same thing with the 11 Pro. I think for the most part they did a good job embracing it, but the iPhone 10 was definitely the best example of that. And them hiding it in later models was likely due to much of the controversy that had come from the notch, despite the fact that the notch just became a non-factor when actually using the phone. It's something that was hard to explain to someone who didn't have an iPhone 10 back in the day, because they'd look at the phone and immediately stare at the big obvious notch. Whereas when I had looked at the phone, I didn't see the notch so much as the entire display itself. And over time, as the phone became common to me, I think it also became common to the general populace. Less and less people seem to care. These days, you don't hear so much complaining about the dynamic island because not only has Apple implemented it well, it's a pretty cool feature, but it also just blends into the experience, even if it's a bit bigger and more obvious than something Samsung would have. Of course, there were some teething issues early on, don't get me wrong, actually plenty of issues, in particular with iOS 11. Right from launch, some apps weren't yet updated to take advantage of the taller display. This is a very old clip I have of, I think, Spotify as an example where the app would just have big black bars on the top and bottom, replicating the bezels of previous phones. If you find an app that hasn't been updated in the past 7 years, it'll still look like this. It's actually here we can see what is probably my sole issue with the design of the iPhone 10, and it's the size. I think originally Apple no doubt wanted to have a max size option to sell alongside the base model, which was 5.8 inches diagonally and had a similar footprint to the smaller iPhone 8. The 8 Plus had only a 5.5 inch display, but it was physically much larger, and the screen itself felt bigger due to the fact that it was wider. The iPhone 10 gained much of its inches in height, which wasn't so useful when watching YouTube videos at a 16:9 aspect ratio, as an example. The iPhone XS Max the next year was 6.5 inches, which is a bit smaller than modern Pro iPhones. The base models would also eventually get bigger, but still not too dissimilar from today. My personal theory has always been that Apple originally planned to release the iPhone 10 in 2018, not 2017, but rushed it a year early to get ahead of the pack, especially with that Galaxy S8 looking far more modern and sleek than the iPhone 7 comparatively. The iPhone 10 was delayed until November, something Apple has not done since, nor even before, I don't think they've delayed a specific phone like that. The iPhone 4's white color was delayed massively back in the day, but aside from that, in 2020 pushing things back a little bit, there haven't been too much in terms of Apple having to delay a specific phone. The iPhone 10 also had only 2 color options, the first iPhone to come in only white or black since the iPhone 5 in 2012. Gold had become a mainstay in basically every flagship smartphone regardless of the brand. But if Apple was rushing to get the iPhone 10 out the door to begin with, it would make sense they decided to focus on only having 2 options. It was kind of a nice throwback. It would also explain as well why the iPhone XS was such a minor upgrade, possibly the smallest iPhone upgrade ever. It brought very slight improvements to the cameras, a faster chipset as always, then the gold color and max size option. That was practically it. Had 2018 been the initial timeline for the 10 to come out, then things make more sense. There's also the issue of no iPhone 9 existing, and considering that the XS was the last S model iPhone to ever exist, I don't think it's hard to imagine that Apple maybe hadn't originally planned to go that route. Consider the fact as well that after the iPhone 7, we didn't see the 7S. We saw the 8, breaking the pattern of an S phone every other year. Maybe at this point point, they had originally planned to be done with the S models altogether, and perhaps the iPhone XR was supposed to be the iPhone 9. Then the iPhone 10 and 10 Max would come out alongside it in 2018, bridging the gap between the LCD phones of old and the OLED Super Retina notched phones of new. Or maybe they would have skipped to the Pro name altogether, who knows, right? It was named X or 10 after the anniversary of iPhone, that's what they said anyways, and those Roman numerals, man, they made for a lot of confusion back in the day. I cannot tell you how many people called this thing the iPhone X, pretty much everyone. And then you had the XS the next year. XS, not exactly what you would want to call your phone normally. XR, which made very little sense. It was just a confusing time. This might all seem like an unrelated tangent, but it's the push to get the phone out in 2017 rather than 2018 that makes the iPhone X so special to me. It shows that Apple was actually trying, really trying to be innovative and the first to the punch. Whereas now, and even in years leading up to the iPhone X, it often feels like they're happy to just sit around and not bother putting in basic features until it's far too late. High refresh rate displays, for example, came years after competitors had introduced it, and while some aspects of the iPhone X, such as wireless charging and even fast charging, technically were late compared to other smartphones, everything else had more than made up for the wait. Even OLED was something Samsung had been doing for years, but at least if Apple was going to bring it to their phones, they were going to do it in the most dramatic fashion possible, as well as at a time where the technology was pretty darn good. The iPhone X showed that Apple still could be experimental and could do something no one else had done before that point. While everyone would quickly catch up just like they had with the Retina display and the iPhone 4, it was still Apple that did it first, and even more importantly, it was Apple who did it best. The design of the iPhone X also thrust the phone into once again a whole new level of premium, harkening back to the iPhone 4 of old.
That's really nice looking. I got the silver because it reminded me of a certain phone.
The curved, polished stainless steel frame perfectly contrasts with the glossy glass back, and then you've got the vertical camera bump, which I think fits the phone's look quite well. I am a sucker for the frosted glass that came in the iPhone 11 Pro, and that's something that's more or less stuck around since, but the iPhone X still pulled off this beautiful look, and even if the 15 Pro did do titanium and the 12 Pro flattened the sides, the general structure of the iPhone X lives on today, particularly from the front. That notch would eventually shrink, with the iPhone 13 and 13 Pro finally cutting it down in 2021. And the 14 Pro reduced it to the dynamic islands the next year. Bezels, of course, have also gotten slimmer, but the iPhone X really still holds up fantastically well, whichever way we look at things. And what it really managed to do better than any other phone out at the time was verticality. Really, the key innovation and cornerstone for the current era of smartphones hinges on that single element of design, verticality. Just as televisions evolved to the point of becoming wider, smartphones have gradually become taller over time, and it was the iPhone X that nailed it so perfectly and really established the verticality in iPhones moving forward. It had an aspect ratio of 19.5 by 9, the same ratio Apple's been using for iPhone ever since. It's easy to forget that apps like TikTok were not yet super popular in 2017, at least relative to the absurd numbers they would see in a few short years. The central mechanic of TikTok that's been replicated in Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts is having a vertical video fill your smartphone screen. Then, to get to the next piece of content, you need only swipe up. The matter of fact is that, at least generally speaking, it is more comfortable to hold your phone vertically than it is sideways. It's natural and easy, so content made specifically for that position makes all too much sense. Social media had already been doing this for years, and swiping up to the next video really is just a natural extension of scrolling through tweets, Instagram posts, Facebook, or whatever else you might be doing on your phone. It's a natural evolution of that basic scrolling functionality Steve Jobs had shown the world back in 2007. The 16:9 ratio in smartphones was always going to end up dying eventually because it no longer made sense to confine media content to such restrictions. You had so much empty space both above and below the display of your phone, and while sure, you might have a home button down there which added some usefulness, ultimately it was just logical to remove those altogether and make your screen taller, thus fitting more of the content we scroll and swipe through so regularly. I could gush about this phone forever, but this video's gone on long enough, so I'll try to hold back a bit here. Basically, when it comes down to brass tacks, the iPhone X was the future of iPhone, a fact that has remained to this day. It set forth a new design that wasn't just new for Apple, but new for the entire industry. And even if you weren't a fan back then, there's a reason iPhones still don't look a whole lot different all these years later. Combined with the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, 2017 looks like a a heck of a year for iPhone users, and there was plenty of variety. Those who didn't want to move on from Touch ID and the home button still had options with phones that were still great in their own right and full-on flagships. There was very little difference between the 8 Plus and the 10, and in fact the 8 Plus had some benefits like better battery life. The 10's telephoto lens was optically stabilized, and I think beyond that there weren't really any improvements going to the 10 from the 8 aside from the whole display. The $1,000 price tag of the iPhone 10 was heavily criticized at the time, and the reason for that is very understandable. Apple had crossed a threshold that felt shocking. Even if this was perhaps one of the only phones I've ever been truly comfortable saying was absolutely worth the $1,000 price. It was that ahead of its time, at least to me. Again, there were some early issues and controversies, even aside from the cost of the phone. iOS 11 was easily the most buggy release of iOS we've ever had, and I think this lends into my theory of the iPhone 10 being rushed by a year. Apple had less time to perfect their software, which felt admittedly out of character for them. Now, I myself didn't have a terrible time with iOS 11. It definitely got better over time. I felt like the phone performed fine as far as I remember. The battery life wasn't amazing, but it was okay. And overall, I had a pretty good experience my year with the phone. But it's worth noting that things certainly weren't perfect. iOS 12, in the very least, cleaned up the vast majority of any remaining issues that hadn't already been quashed, and even optimized performance on older iPhones as mentioned earlier. That was amazing. Thus far, I believe the iPhone 10 is the peak of iPhone, and while there are many other great devices to come before it, the fact that it's still held up in design as well as it has, along with being so innovative for the time, really makes me think this makes sense as the climax and peak of iPhone as a whole. The hype back in 2017 for this phone was also through the roof, and unlike any hype for any iPhone I've personally seen come since. Now, one could argue this was just my own subjective opinion at the time based on my own situation where this was the first iPhone I was buying brand new. And sure, that absolutely would have contributed to the hype, or rather my own individual perception of the hype. When you yourself are involved in something, you're excited, it can often seem like everybody is, even if they're not. However, in the case of the iPhone 10, I definitely was not alone. I think it makes sense that such a definitive redesign that so drastically shook up the core iOS experience would inevitably be as hyped as it was. When I bought the iPhone 10, staying up till midnight to pre-order it as quickly as possible, I still wasn't able to get the phone day one. I think it came a week or so after because the demand was just that high and the supply took months and months to catch up. That was a real thing. The iPhone 10 was constantly out of stock, which makes sense considering it was both delayed and rushed, and it's also not something we really see anymore, at least to such an extent, from Apple. All this in spite of the $1,000 price tag. Yeah, the iPhone 10 definitely had hype behind it, no question about it. All this being said, the iPhone 10 had left plenty of room for improvement and refinement in future models. To say it is the peak and then call it a day would be awfully presumptuous. So let's continue down the rabbit hole and see exactly what came next. 2018 would see the iPhone XS, XS Max, and the all-new iPhone XR. Easily the strangest naming scheme Apple has ever used, but the idea was simple enough, with basically a non-Pro option in the XR, and then Pro models in the XS and larger XS Max. See, even I'm saying it wrong now, and I'm reading off a script. Again, bad names, Apple, what were you thinking? As already discussed, the iPhone XS really wasn't much of an upgrade over the 10 in any meaningful way, and I think that's why they wanted to make sure it was an S phone, the final S model. Having the Max option was certainly very much needed for those who preferred larger phones, but beyond that, it was just a slightly better iteration of the same thing we saw in 2017. The iPhone XR, on the other hand, was a bit more interesting. It managed to bring an LCD panel with the same edge-to-edge form factor, albeit with larger bezels than the 10 and XS. The size was 6.1 inches, which would eventually be the same size as the base Pro iPhones. So it was slightly larger than the iPhone 10, and in my opinion, a really more ideal size, at least for myself. The battery life with the lower powered LCD was significantly better than that of the XS, which was a phone that really struggled in that category, at least to my own personal experience. Back in 2018, I had bought the iPhone XS, not the XS Max, and I think that was a mistake. The XR brought colors back to iPhone in a big way, harkening back to the iPhone 5C. We've really still not seen colors quite so bright and vivid as in these iPhones, and that coral in particular is still one of my favorite iPhone colors to this day. Where the iPhone 5C had failed, the XR managed to succeed. It had the exact same specs as the XS, the same chipset and the same main camera, although no telephoto lens, something most users probably wouldn't miss so much anyways. It was the same phone in a more cost-efficient body, and for $250 less less than the iPhone XS, it was actually a pretty good deal for the time. Yes, there was some slight controversy with the display, since the resolution wasn't particularly high, but for those who wanted something better, you could always shell out some extra cash. This was a great smartphone, and while the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus technically were the beginning of the non-Pro variant pattern that we've become so accustomed to, this phone feels much closer to what we see now year to year. One thing I will add to this is that the iPhone XR didn't have 3D Touch, whereas the XS did. In fact, the XS was the last phone to have 3D Touch. I've always felt that was a real shame. Removing 3D Touch was helpful for increasing the battery size in future generations, and there wasn't really any impacts against the experience to lose 3D Touch, but that was always the problem, the fact that Apple never utilized their own innovative technology properly. It sucks, but it is what it is, and this would be 3D Touch's last hurrah. All in all, 2018 wasn't a fantastic or standout year by any means, but it was respectable. For as milquetoast as the XS was, the XR managed to really add some much needed pizzazz to the iPhone line, and things could only go up from here. The iPhone 11 and 11 Pro are phones I believe make a very strong argument for being the peak of iPhone, and the main reason is twofold. For one, they finished fully establishing the current trend and pattern of how subsequent models of iPhone would release in the future. I do not foresee Apple breaking this pattern anytime soon. It could happen. I'd in fact be surprised if they didn't at some point, calling something Ultra or some other silly suffix, but this foundation of having a slightly more budget-oriented iPhone alongside the higher spec iPhone is one that makes a lot of sense, and while it had been done poorly with the iPhone 5C and 5S in the past, it would eventually be executed much better. There is a worry, however, in maintaining a justified gap between the Pro and non-Pro variants. The 5C's biggest issue was that it was far too undercooked compared to the 5S, in that it had all the specs of 2012 with none of the price benefit that should have come with it. This was a far more problematic thing a decade ago, where smartphones saw much more substantial improvements on a yearly basis. The 5S was 64-bit, for example, and as a result, it got 2 full extra iOS iterations over the 5C, despite being released at the exact same time. Nowadays, this isn't so much an issue, and while I'm still not pleased with the iPhone 14, Apple stopped giving the best processor in their lower-priced iPhones, there is a very high probability that the iPhone 14 or 15 will get just as many updates as its Pro counterpart. Still, the fact is that there is a certain level of value that's been lacking for a little while, and I think the ultimate value of one of Apple's non-Pro iPhones may have in fact peaked with the iPhone 11. And that's really the second main reason I think 2019's iPhones might have claim to the peak of iPhone, thanks to the almost suspiciously solid value proposition across the lineup as a whole. The iPhone XR had started at $750, the iPhone XS $1,000, and the XS Max $1,100, while the 11 Pro would again cost $1,000 at the same 64 gigabytes, and the Pro Max $100 more than that. The iPhone 11 would see a price tag of $700, $50 less than the iPhone XR. I struggle to name many other times Apple has actually lowered their prices like this. While $50 might not seem like perhaps all that much, it's still something Apple doesn't really do anymore, instead usually opting to creep up the price whenever they possibly can. But refocusing here, I loved my iPhone 11 Pro Max, a phone I bought at launch in 2019. It felt like a real and immense upgrade from my iPhone XS, which itself hadn't really felt any different from the iPhone X. Partly my own fault, I literally got the same color and size as I had with the iPhone X, but as discussed, the XS really wasn't much of an upgrade anyways. I got the Max this time around because I felt like the iPhone X and XS display was just a little too small for myself, and I never had any regrets in doing so. The phone felt extremely premium, with a similar frosted glass to that of the Pixel 3, which I had really liked. The new camera bump seemed extremely large to me at the time, but now seems tiny relative to newer iPhones. Apple also made the bold move to really clean up the design of iPhones, and it's easy to forget this was a moderately controversial change. Not everyone thought it looked good, but Apple centered the Apple logo and removed the iPhone wordmark altogether. I myself at the time thought it felt wrong, but as with most design changes, it didn't take too long for me to get used to it, and even eventually prefer it over what came previously. The midnight green color was an important step in giving some much needed color and variety to iPhone flagships, something that had been lacking really since the iPhone 7. Sure, gold iPhone XS, but having a fourth option that was completely new to pretty much any smartphone, I don't remember too many green phones before the 11 Pro, it just really lended to the phone feeling fresh. The design of this phone, though it lacks the flat sides in the iPhone 12 and newer, still feels extremely similar to more modern iPhones. It's hard to believe it's a half-decade old, and it's even crazier when you think about how little Apple's iPhone designs have really changed in that time period. Battery life saw, to my recollection, the biggest yearly jump of any iPhone, with the 5.8-inch iPhone 11 Pro lasting 4 more hours in video playback than the iPhone XS, and the 11 Pro Max getting 5 more hours than the XS Max. My jaw dropped during the Apple presentation when they showed those numbers. That is a huge jump. Normally you're seeing 1 hour, maybe 2 if you're lucky, with most yearly increases. I also immediately felt the improvement when I got the phone, especially considering I went from an iPhone XS to an 11 Pro Max. My battery life went from barely lasting me a day, and not even if I was watching a lot of YouTube or using my phone just too much, to being so good I never even had to think about it regardless of how many hours of screen time I had. The triple lens setup here established the core trio of cameras we've maintained to this day: an ultra-wide sensor, a normal wide sensor, and then of course the telephoto lens, which has seen changes in the zoom range but is still an integral aspect of the phone. The quality of photography also saw one of the biggest leaps forward in iPhone history. Not only did we now have exceptional versatility in how we could take photos with so many zoom ranges, but we also received far better low light performance, a critical step up since it was one of the places iPhones had been most lacking in recent years at this point. Pictures would look far better in pretty much any situation. And while previous smartphones hadn't had bad cameras, even going back as far as the iPhone 6S, I can say those photos still hold up to a point, there was a level of reliability as well as that versatility with the 11 Pro that gave me far more confidence in my phone's camera than anything I had ever known prior. I left talking about the camera improvements for last because they also came to the iPhone 11, making the phone even better value than it already would have been with just that $50 price decrease. Had the phone only had one camera lens like the XR, I think it would have been still a decent option. But in a rare moment of Apple making a consumer-friendly move, they also gave it the new ultra-wide camera lens, meaning their mid-range flagship now had the flashiest, newest, most exciting feature that was coming with their Pro model. The night mode photography also came here as well, along with the same processor and the A13 chipset. This wasn't really a lesser phone than the iPhone 11 Pro, it just had a lower quality display and not as sleek a build. Retaining the glossy glass lent to the phone feeling less premium, but it also didn't detract from it still feeling well designed and comfortable in the hand. The relatively low resolution Retina LCD screen was the same as the XR, and while that had been a sticking point for some tech reviewers in 2018, the colossal commercial success of the iPhone XR showed what many had been saying all along: the screen not being as sharp as the best iPhone didn't really matter because it was good enough for the average consumer, and most importantly, good enough for the people actually buying the device. Those who really understand and care about pixel density and resolution are not going to be the same people buying non-Pro iPhones, at least generally speaking. Of course, nowadays, since the iPhone 12, it doesn't really matter, but back in 2019, the iPhone 11 was the perfect phone for our parents, siblings, anyone who really needed a solid device but didn't want to pay an excessive amount of money. The 11 was every bit as capable as the 11 Pro, only losing out on the extra telephoto camera lens, something that ultimately has never been a big deal. The ultra-wide was the better ad, because not only was it the newest thing, which was more enticing for new users, but you can't zoom out from your wide lens. You can zoom in digitally if you want to and don't have a telephoto, but you can't zoom out. Thus, the ultra-wide I think makes more sense being the second camera lens. And with portrait mode having been added to the XR using software processing, there was no big feature gated behind having the more expensive iPhone like it had been with the iPhone 7 and 8. The iPhone lineup in 2019 was also potentially at its best ever in terms of having options for consumers at every price point. The iPhone 8 was the cheapest choice, starting at $450, with the 8 Plus still being available at $550, compared to the XR at $600, which itself became again one of the best value smartphones Apple's ever sold. After all, while the cameras were significantly better on the iPhone 11, that really was the biggest change, so if you didn't care about that, saving $100 with the iPhone XR was an intriguing option. The 11 Pro, starting at $1,000, was a lot of money as always, but considering the improvements brought this year, it did feel genuinely fair, at least to me at the time. To this day, I still consider going to the 11 Pro Max from the XS one of the biggest upgrades I've ever had in any device, and probably only second to going to the iPhone X from my 6S. While the 11 Pro didn't shake up the experience itself like the 10 did, it refined it to a point that I now felt truly satisfied with the state of iOS. Dark mode being added with iOS 13 was something I had desperately wanted for years, almost always jailbreaking when possible to achieve that very feature. I actually still ended up jailbreaking my 11 Pro Max, which was cool, and it was, I believe, the last flagship I've owned that I jailbroke since iOS has improved significantly and added so many of the features I felt needed to be there in years prior. While that iPhone lineup had a ton of great variety, it wasn't perfect. The iPhone 8 Plus being $550 and the XR being $600 felt strange, range, and I found it hard to see the 8 Plus as any sort of good deal. Sure, you still had the home button there, and there was a certain value to that for a niche subset of users, but for only $50 more you could get a phone with a faster processor and a better camera, albeit with only a single lens. And looking back, the iPhone XR did end up with far more iOS support than the iPhone 8, as well as the 8 Plus and the 10. 2017 phones got through to iOS 16, whereas the XR is fully updatable to iOS 18 along with the XS and XS Max. Thankfully, this weird issue between the 8 Plus and the XR would be dealt with pretty quickly. Oh, also, one last thing about the 11 Pro, it was the only iPhone to ever come with a fast charging brick, an actually amazing addition that lended to its overall value. Clearly, this was a pretty amazing time to buy a new iPhone, but Apple wasn't quite done cooking yet. If we lumped in the first generation iPhone SE with the iPhone 6s and 6s Plus, then it's only fair we talked about the second generation with the iPhone 11 and 11 Pro. Released 4 years after its predecessor, the second gen iPhone SE was less of a direct follow-up, but instead a spiritual successor, mimicking a similar strategy and using the popular iPhone 8's design and home button whilst adding the specs of the iPhone 11. Unfortunately, while I very much liked this move on paper, there were also some worrying signs of Apple's cheapness creeping back into view, but let's start with the good. The iPhone SE replaced the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus April 2020, announced via a press release on Apple's website rather than a normal keynote. This was a bit out of cater for Apple, but once you remember exactly what life was like back in April 2020, it does make some sense. This was a pretty timely phone really, being only $400 US, actually $50 less than the iPhone 8 had cost, and marking yet another time Apple lowered prices when they probably didn't need to. Man, at least for pricing, this might have been a golden age for iPhone. While there's some good here and the value proposition was appealing, heck, I had a video years back basically saying I was really impressed by Apple for this phone, there were still cracks that would end up being precursors to the disaster that I personally consider the third gen iPhone SE to be. The first iPhone SE had taken the body of the iPhone 5S, but changed the internals to such a significant degree to having both the same processor and camera system as the iPhone 6s, making that phone every bit as capable for significantly less cost. The second iPhone SE was similar in that it took the body of the iPhone 8 and updated the processor, but Apple in this case didn't end up bringing in a new camera, opting instead for the exact same sensor that was in the 2017 phone. This was an iPhone 8 with the A13 chipset instead of the A11, and that was it. They got an extra gigabyte of RAM as well, matching the iPhone 11 for performance, but oddly enough, the battery life was its weakest aspect, despite the impressive life that was achieved on Apple's other A13 devices. The battery was just small, the phone was small, the camera wasn't great, but even so, this was replacing the iPhone 8 for $50 less, while being an objectively better device. This was still overall a strong phone from Apple, and perfect for those not ready to move on from the home button, as well as anyone looking for a more budget-oriented iPhone. It would be up to the potentially future iPhone SE models to not only keep the value in check at that $400 price tag, but also keep the internal specs more relevant. That iPhone 8 hardware was only 2.5 years old when this phone came out, and while having no night mode photography was a little bit rough, the extra processing power obtained by the A13 did mean that photos looked a bit better, and thankfully there was now a portrait mode as well. Despite some misgivings, the iPhone SE again was mostly a good iPhone, and the iPhone lineup now was as strong as it had ever been. The future was bright for iPhone, and this would be reflected in the sales numbers, with Apple in the midst of seeing some of their strongest years ever to this point. But is this really the peak of iPhone? As much as I think the lineup may have been very much ideal around this time, there's still a certain lack of pizzazz and feelings of seeing something special with the iPhone 11 line. The 11 Pro was about as solid as a refinement can possibly be, but it wasn't anything new. Frosted glass, midnight green, fantastic battery, triple camera lens setup, all invaluable additions, but there's still no shaking the notion that the phone is simply a better iPhone 10. And it's a feeling that's only going to just keep cropping up as we continue along, so let's do just that. 5G. If there's one thing I remember from the iPhone 12 presentation October 2020, is that these new phones brought 5G, and probably a few other things. In fact, this time around, we saw what was, at least on paper, quite the shakeup, with the iPhone 11 being succeeded by the iPhone 12 and 12 mini. The mini would be 5.4 inches, with a footprint not far off from the iPhone 5 and 5S, and it even looks quite similar to those phones thanks to the now flat sides. The display itself managed to still be a fair size though, thanks to removing the bezels, and while the notch did feel kinda large large on the small screen, the package as a whole was extremely compact and frankly impressive. The former LCD and thick bezels of the iPhone XR and 11 was gone, replaced by a high-resolution OLED that was every bit as good as the iPhone 12 Pro. The 12 Pro looked cosmetically different from the 11 Pro, but it actually didn't bring a whole lot new to the table aside from that design. That's not nothing though, and the design did form the new standard for future generations of iPhone. The $1,000 12 Pro saw a size increase to 6.1 inches from 5.8, a very welcome addition, and the Pro Max went from 6.5 inches to 6.7. The headlining new feature exclusive to the Pros was LiDAR, which allowed the phone to capture precise depth of data with the camera, something that didn't add a whole lot of practical functionality for the average user, but I'll take it, why not? Now if you notice that in talking about the 12 Pro I'm not using my own B-roll, there's a reason. This was the only time since the iPhone X came out that I didn't end up buying the major flagship at launch, instead opting for the iPhone 12. And this is due to what I think makes the iPhone 12 line so unique compared to other years. There was very little difference between the non-Pro and Pro variants of iPhone, which could be both a good and bad thing. Let's start with the new features that were shared across both devices. The A14 chipset, which was your standard processor upgrade, that also came with 5G networking. 5G was never really a big deal for myself. I always found that LTE was plenty fast enough where I lived, but it was the flashy new feature every smartphone from around this time was advertising, so it was ultimately inevitable and not unwelcome. We got MagSafe, which allows for magnetic wireless charging, a far more practical solution than AirPower ever was, which I never really talked about, but was announced at the time of the iPhone X and never came out due to Apple not being able to figure out how to make it work without bursting into flames. I actually at one point had a working prototype, but thankfully didn't burn my house down, and that's a story for another time. There's the ceramic shield, which supposedly made the phones more durable, but glass is still glass, and we all know what happens there if you drop a phone hard enough. And so those are the major shared features across the phones if I'm not missing anything. As for differences, the 12 Pro had 6 gigs of RAM versus 4 on the 12. It had 3 camera lenses and LiDAR versus the standard 2, as well as the new ProRAW image capture capabilities. There's of course the more premium frosted glass design. The base model came with 128 gigs versus 64 on the 12, and that's basically it. Maybe there's some more little stuff, but because the 12 brought the OLED screen, there was suddenly far less features to entice users to jump to the Pro model, and the camera really felt like the only upgrade for a significant sum of money. In fact, the iPhone 12 and 12 Pro were so incredibly similar that the 6.1-inch models actually had interchangeable cases. Any case bought for the 12 would fit on the 12 Pro and vice versa, which was sort of wild in hindsight. As for the value of Apple's lineup at large, we did see some of Apple's price creep here, although it was fairly understandable given the context of the iPhone 12 and 12 mini, now coming with an OLED panel over the no doubt far cheaper to produce LCD of the iPhone 11 and 10R. The 12 mini started at $700, the 12 $800, and then of course the 12 Pro $1,000 and $1,100 for the Pro Max as per the norm. Like the iPhone XR and 11, you could pay an extra $50 to double the storage of the iPhone 12 to 128 gigs. So yeah, given how similar the phones were, I opted for the iPhone 12 instead of the 12 Pro. I liked the size at the time, and despite it only having 2 lenses, it didn't really feel like a downgrade from my 11 Pro Max, more of a lateral move. This decision also spawned from my annoyance at Apple not increasing the refresh rate of the 12 Pro. 60Hz felt limiting, whereas the Galaxy S20 from March 2020 had 120Hz, and even the Pixel 4 and 5 had 90Hz. That doesn't matter so much anymore, but what does still impact the smartphone world all these years later was Apple's decision to remove the charging bricks and earpods from their iPhone packaging, all under the guise of being environmentally friendly. Hey, if fighting climate change just so happens to help Apple's bottom line, who's to argue with that, right? This is one of those ominous signs of Apple being cheap for really no reason. Well, yeah, sure, those 5-watt adapters were a dime a dozen and maybe made a minimal impact on landfills. Why not then just remove the brick from the iPhone 12 but retain the fast charger with the 12 Pro? Oh, because then Apple wouldn't save nearly as much money, nor make the money spent by people who are now buying a phone and have no way to charge said phone. Think about it, you could be buying an iPhone 12, open it up with its Lightning to USB-C charging cable, and if you don't already own a charger from a previous iPhone and don't have a computer or anything with a USB-C port, you could literally have zero way to charge your phone out of the box. It is insane that Apple got away with doing this, but unfortunately it's oh so typical. You could also have a sales option that gave a discount if you purposely chose not to receive a charger with your phone, but again, bottom line, and the result from this was Apple saving no doubt millions upon millions of dollars thanks to not including those pieces of plastic as well as reducing the packaging size. This has always left a sour taste in my mouth, and it does affect how I look at these phones. There was still a lot of good, however. The high point of the iPhone 12 line was without any question the 12 mini, which showed that Apple hadn't yet completely disregarded the niche users who had been clinging to phones with a smaller form factor. year. The fact that Apple even made this device, which was a true flagship with zero compromise from the bigger 12 and very little from the 12 Pro, was honestly amazing to see, and while again the number of people this appealed to was relatively small, hence why unfortunately Apple no longer makes mini phones, that group does still very much exist, and with the removal of the home button and reduction in bezel size, it just made so much sense they would do this. While battery life could be rough due to the extremely small form factor, especially as the health degraded over time, the phone itself was and still is a really impressive fun little device. The iPhone 12 and 12 mini were fantastic upgrades to the iPhone 11 for not a whole lot more money, but the 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max were incredibly disappointing to myself in 2020, even if they did bring a somewhat new design. Overall, this was a decent year for Apple, but nothing incredibly special. Had the 12 Pro been a greater upgrade, I'd be inclined to hold the 12 line in higher regard. But even then, I don't think this would be iPhone's peak by any means, and it does show a lot of Apple's cheapness becoming more of a commonality. The iPhone 13 and 13 mini would launch alongside the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max fall 2021, and this time around I did end up getting the 13 Pro. I absolutely loved the phone. It felt like an immense upgrade from my 12. Part of that would have heralded from being a Pro, but thankfully a lot of the big improvements did come to the entire 13 line. Design-wise, at least from the back, none of the phones changed a whole lot, with probably the most notable difference being the now diagonally placed iPhone 13 lenses, along with the new slew of colors as had become standard. The 13 mini's battery life was also far more acceptable than that of the 12 mini, even if it was still a small phone and you can only do so much with the limited space. The 13 Pro Max's battery life in particular was extremely impressive even to this day, and I certainly had no troubles with my smaller 13 Pro, a phone my brother is still using. The A15 chipset came to all models, but with the 13 Pro getting a slightly better version with 1 extra GPU core and 6 gigs of RAM versus only 4. Keep that chipset in mind because it'll be somehow relevant for 2022. The cameras on the 13 Pro remained 12 megapixels, but they were pretty fantastic, and I remember being very impressed with how far things had come. Plus, the telephoto now was a 3x optical zoom rather than 2, which I did like. We also got the ProRes video recording and cinematic video mode, which I've probably used like once or twice in my lifetime. The big upgrade on the 13 Pro was definitely Pro Motion, which I was extremely happy to see. That flow I spoke of earlier for iOS managed to become even smoother and more fluid thanks to 120 Hz, but it's also something not everyone will notice nor care about, thus it made sense to lock it behind the Pro models. The other improvement I didn't see as the biggest deal but was still happy to have was of course the reduced notch size, as it got 20% smaller. That doesn't sound like a lot, but in practice it's quite the difference. The iPhone 13 mini in particular benefited the most, as since the display is so small, the notch is invariably going to be more intrusive and take up a greater portion of the screen than any larger model. I don't have too much to say in terms of further upgrades, but don't take the lack of discussion here as a sign that these phones weren't great. The iPhone 12 had brought the updated sizes and designs that carried over to the 13 line, which means we've already covered a lot of the basics. And the refinements made here are very impressive, nearly perfecting all the issues I had with the 2020 models. Battery life improvements, ProMotion, and a smaller notch in conjunction with the further improved photography and general upgrades you would expect make the 13 and 13 Pro some of the best iPhone models I think we've seen in recent years. I really loved my 13 Pro, and coming into this video, I did think these devices might have an outside chance of qualifying for the peak of iPhone as a whole. Now, part of the reason that I like these phones so much comes down to what Apple did the next year. And so to show why I love these phones so much, perhaps we should just go ahead and continue. But before we can get to the iPhone 14, we do have an additional smartphone to lump in with the 13 and 13 Pro. There is no iPhone I've ever had more mixed feelings towards than the 3rd generation iPhone SE. The reason for it coming in the first place was obvious, to bring 5G networking, which was notably absent from Apple's budget selection. The SE3 was announced March 2022 and released the same month, now starting at $429 rather than $399. This was a time where inflation was rampant, but it still sucked that they did this. For one thing, Apple was saving money they originally hadn't been saving with the SE2 by having a smaller box and not including the charger or earpods since the iPhone 12 launch. They made the change across all of their phones. Beyond just that, any price increase seen in the US causes far greater increases worldwide. Actually, while the $1,000 price tag had somehow been unchanged since the iPhone 10 in the US, this didn't translate to other countries. iPhones can be far more expensive than ever depending on where you live, and Apple making their cheapest model even slightly more expensive puts their devices even further out of reach for too many potential users. But whatever, if the new iPhone SE is far better, then it would be worth the price increase, right? Well, let's go ahead and do a definitive list of every single upgrade to see if that's the case. We now have the same A15 Bionic chipset as the iPhone 13, as well as 4 gigs of RAM compared to the A13 and 3 gigs of RAM of its predecessor. Again, this of course means 5G networking, though no mmWave 5G, as well as improved computational photography thanks to the better chipset. Also because of the chipset, the battery life got slightly better, though it's still not very good. Next, we got nothing else. That's right, this was it. If you remember, the second gen iPhone SE was in my eyes a pretty decent device, and while it only solely brought a new chipset, the hardware wasn't yet too out of date. March 2022, however, the iPhone 8 was already 4.5 years old, and yet we received a smartphone that was not only more expensive than the previous SE, but still retained the exact same hardware as the 2017 iPhone 8, just now with the A15 chip. I really don't even know what to say about this other than this is easily Apple's laziest smartphone of all time. You could argue not the worst, since practically speaking, the phone is still very capable and can provide a good experience for the right type of user. If you want the home button and don't use your phone too heavily, the battery life will likely be good enough for you, and speeds certainly aren't an issue. The camera is really lacking, not even having night photography, which is absurd, but it can capture decent enough images by nature of the iPhone 8 having a good camera to begin with. Because yes, this is the exact same sensor as that phone, only benefiting slightly from the added processing power and software that comes along with it. March 2022, when this phone came out, I don't think it was a terrible deal at $430, especially for those who still live and die by the home button. But as time continued on and Apple refused to upgrade it or replace it with a newer model, even as of uploading this video, look, I don't care if a new iPhone SE is right around the corner. Apple should be getting a lot more backlash for still selling what is now a 7-year-old smartphone with a 3-year-old processor for literally anything more than maybe $250. It is insane they can get away with this. And again, while the phone has never been bad by nature of being an iPhone with a relatively modern processor, the value proposition is of the worst Apple has ever offered. The iPhone SE3 represents Apple's frugality and pettiness at its worst. It's indicative of everything wrong with modern Apple, and it absolutely drags down the iPhone lineup from around this time. Where iPhone peaked is always going to be debatable, but it certainly wasn't here. This is likely as far as we'll go in talking about iPhone models. The iPhone 15 and 16 as always bring further incremental upgrades, but Apple does seem to be in a bit of a rut in terms of more generational leaps. So it's with these phones I think we'll start to finally wind down this video. Let's start with the good, or perhaps rather the okay, the iPhone 14 Pro and 14 Pro Max. These would be fairly decent upgrades. First, the main camera was now 48 megapixels, so that's cool. The most talked about feature was the dynamic island, which converted the now reduced notch into a floating pill-shaped cutout, something more akin to what Androids had been doing but with Apple's own spin. On one hand, it was much larger and more intrusive than what was typical from Android flagships, which often are just a small black dot for the camera, but Apple with the Face ID sensors needs to cram more up there, so they decided to put a spin on things in really a way only Apple could do. The dynamic island is beyond all odds a fantastic feature. It expands and retracts based on what you're doing, hosting things like currently playing media content to give an easy way to control playback and get back to it quickly. There's also cute little animations based on what you do, and it all ends up becoming an incredibly natural and almost integral part of the experience. I'll be honest, Apple surprised me with how good a job they did with this, and as silly as the name Dynamic Island might seem, the feature actually does somehow live up to that name. It isn't perfect, and the main issue for me was that it cuts into video that's playing at a 2:1 aspect ratio, whereas the previous notch didn't. There's actually now less space on your screen for usable content, as the Dynamic Island sits a little lower than the notch did. It isn't a huge deal, but it feels weird and like it could have been designed a bit better. I still wouldn't give it up for the old notch though, since having your media content always available without dragging down the control center is extremely convenient. The Dynamic Island represents a slice of what made the iPhone X so great, embracing a part of the phone that might be considered a problem or downside on other devices, and instead turning it into a core part of the phone's identity, and even implementing it into the software to make it bigger or smaller dependent on the context. It is brilliant design, and while the entire basis of this video might be centered around that iPhone has already peaked, with its best days behind it, that doesn't mean Apple isn't still making great products, or don't even have really good ideas here and there. Every iPhone they've ever made has brought at least one feature I think very much makes it definitively better than the previous model. As much as I might clown on the iPhone SE3, it did at least have a faster chipset than the SE2, even if that was the only change. Every iPhone that comes out brings some form of new peak, depending on our criteria, except there there are one or two notable exceptions. The first is the iPhone 5C, which, if you consider it its own thing, doesn't really qualify, but considering it did replace the iPhone 5 outright, it's hard to view it so generously. The second is the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus. As much as I always loved that Apple was making a mini iPhone for their niche subset of users that preferred that form factor, the reality was that these phones weren't selling anywhere near the numbers of their bigger counterparts. And so, Apple decided to just drop them altogether, ending their brief and glorious reign of the mini iPhone. There are further implications, but I've done a video on that before, so we'll just leave it there. In 2022, Apple decided to release the iPhone 14 at the normal size, and then also bring an all-new plus size option, being the same size as the 14 Pro Max, but of course with that less expensive build. Except there's very little benefit carried over to the consumer in having a cheaper plus size option. Looking back, we had a lineup of the iPhone 13 mini at $700, the 13 at $800, 13 Pro at $1,000, and Pro Max at $1,100, which was the norm established with the iPhone 12 line. You would think if Apple actually cared about making phones that were good value, they might make the 6.1-inch iPhone 14 that $700 price tag. But of course not. I mean, you think Apple's gonna care about their users? Not when their bottom line is at risk. So the iPhone 14 would be $800 and the 14 Plus $900, with the 14 Pro again at $1,000 and then Pro Max at $1,100. At least with Apple's price creep, we'll see the same general improvements we do every year, right? The same chipset and new features of the 14 Pro. Oh wait, no we won't, because the iPhone 14 is the iPhone 13, except with the same chipset as the 13 Pro, which, if you remember, contained a whole single extra GPU core. Thank you, Apple, very cool. Okay, there is a little more to it. The iPhone 14 also brought 6 gigs of RAM, which will help with remaining fast in the long term, and there are the standard minor upgrades to photography, even without the 48 megapixel sensor of the Pro. These are not bad phones, they're just terrible upgrades from the 13, and once again a symptom of Apple's continual cheapness infecting their iPhone lineup year after year. All they had to do was reduce the price tag by $100 to make the lack of improvements fair and reasonable, but of course they didn't, because why would they if their phones are gonna sell regardless? Well, apparently the 14 Plus probably didn't sell a whole lot better than the minis did, which does give me, admittedly, probably more satisfaction than it should. But what did Apple expect? For $200 extra, there's a lot of benefit going up to the Pro model of iPhone. ProMotion, the dynamic island, a full generation newer chipset, the new 48 megapixel camera, as well as the other benefits there. It's like Apple realized they had inadvertently made their Pro and non-Pro iPhones too similar in feature set, and reacted by making them as different as possible. The iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are probably the most underwhelming iPhones of all time, and I'm including the iPhone SE 3rd Gen and iPhone XS in that statement. This was bad, and the iPhone 14 Pro being as great as it was doesn't change that fact. And this brings us, for the most part, up to speed. We could talk about the iPhone 15 and 15 Pro, even the 16 and 16 Pro. We could speculate on the 17 and 17 Pro and further down the line, but what's the point? It's funny, but the further I've worked on this video, the less and less I found myself enthused and passionate about what I was discussing. Just like with iPhone, I've garnered fatigue towards this project. I find myself so easily and happily talking about the history of iPhones, the older models that did so much to push innovation and compete within the industry not by merit of just having an Apple logo on the back, but by doing things nobody else had done in quite the same way or quite as well. Even the iPhone 5C, a phone often thought of as the worst iPhone ever made, was able to be different from practically everything on the market. Plastic, sure, but it was so colorful and fun that in the very least it didn't feel like a soulless cash grab, unlike too many of their newer iPhones. It felt like Apple cared, if only a little bit. Johnny Ive left Apple June 2019, forming his own independent firm and continuing to consult with Apple for 3 more years. I really don't think it's a coincidence Apple's iPhones haven't seen too much in the way of a design shakeup since the iPhone 12. They've felt extremely safe. Ive, for as much as he often went too far in his designs, even on occasion hurting aspects of the final products, like with how thin the iPhone 6 was, he still put his heart and soul into everything he envisioned. He was very much similar to Steve Jobs in that he would disregard the engineering requirements, focusing only on the design and aesthetic, and then working backwards from there. He was someone who would always push the envelope and was never satisfied with the status quo. And less than a few years away from hitting the 2-decade mark of iPhone, I can't help but wonder if it's that type of person in a leadership role Apple is now sorely missing. On one hand, this can be a great opportunity for the next generation of iconic designers to rise to the occasion, but there's also the scary possibility that what Jobs and Ive had was lightning in a bottle, and isn't something that can be ever fully replicated, at least from Apple. In my eyes, 2019 and 2021 stand out as the years that offer the most competition for the peak of iPhone since the 10 came out. The iPhone 11, 11 Pro, and 2nd gen iPhone SE all made for an incredibly diverse and strong iPhone lineup. The iPhone 13 and 13 Pro were also fantastic, especially having that mini option. A not only viable smartphone, but a full-fledged flagship in such a compact form factor. Nobody but Apple would do that. And unfortunately, we may never see anything like it again. But the 3rd gen iPhone SE, especially with how it's aged and continued to be sold at the same price since launch, really brings down that entire generation of iPhone. And even without it, there's still no denying that everything we saw from the iPhone 11 to the 13 to the 16 is simply just further incremental improvements and refinements from what was, once upon a time, just one more thing. This is a video I've attempted to write numerous times over the past few years, an effort to encapsulate the frustrated but still very real passion that, for whatever reason, I feel towards this massive corporate entity and their products, a neo-conglomerate that never has and never will give two bits about me. While with time and age it grows more and more difficult to avoid a certain level of apathetic response towards Apple and their new products, I do still care, and I believe it's important to remember all that's been accomplished, and the times where Apple truly still felt like the pinnacle of innovation and the driving force for change they once were. And hence this project, determining when exactly the peak of iPhone was. When did iPhone hit its climax, a point that very well may never be reached again? Well, we've gone through pretty much everything Apple has had to offer the smartphone industry, both the good and the bad. There are numerous ways we can determine the peak of a brand and product, but no single iPhone really seems to fit every piece of criteria. In terms of sales, the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus were the most popular smartphones of all time. In terms of market share, iPhone was at its most dominant around 2012 or so, before Android began to really catch up. In terms of cultural impact, the original iPhone easily was the most influential smartphone ever, and one of the most revolutionary products in human history. In terms of innovation, well, if we put aside the first iPhone, the iPhone 10 definitely seems to fit the bill. Firstly, it managed to eliminate many of the major previous shortcomings of iPhone, like with bringing the OLED screen, a display made by Samsung but designed by Apple's engineers, for what was possibly the best all-around smartphone display to that point. And of course, beyond just that, the iPhone 10 had pushed a bezel-less future like no other phone had, even imparting gesture navigation as the new standard for future smartphones. The design was possibly the most beautiful of any smartphone ever. Also, an emoji. Lump in the iPhone 8 and 8 Plus, strong phones on their own, and every bit as capable as the iPhone 10, and you had the best of both the old and the new. More choice for the consumer is always a positive thing in my mind, and Apple doing this set the precedent for them to continue this release pattern in the future. Still, there are many shortcomings to speak of with the 10th anniversary iPhone, from the confusing name, high price tag, and delayed launch, to the buggy mess that was iOS 11. There was only one modest size option, middling battery life, and in the long term, only 6 years of iOS support, compared to other iPhones having received 7 years, like the iPhone 6s, 10R, and 10s. But Apple isn't perfect, phones aren't perfect, and I believe the iPhone 10 best fits the peak of iPhone because each aspect of the device, from the innovation it brought to the hype surrounding it, felt like the true culmination of everything Apple was building towards over 10 years. It felt like the vision of Steve Jobs had been realized, and that smartphones had ascended into a new era of immersive design and function. The iPhone 10 set the path of technology for the next decade. What the future holds is completely up in the air, and while I do find it doubtful, it's still very possible that the best is yet to come for the iPhone brand. It's difficult to say exactly where things go from here. You can only refine what a smartphone even is so much at this point, alongside bringing ever faster processors and always growing camera sensors. Eventually, every cutout and notch of any kind will probably disappear from the display, but as neat as that might be, they can only enhance the current experience so much. Perhaps down the road, Apple makes a foldable phone. Could happen. Foldables have gotten significantly better in recent years, but even if they do, is that really the future for smartphones? A foldable that'll likely be double the price of the current already extremely expensive Pro models? A device that ultimately works the exact same way but with the added ability to unfold it into a tablet? Maybe that is the future, but if it is, Apple's really late to the party. The iPhone 10 represents a brief moment when Apple wasn't afraid to be bold and release a product that for the first time in a long time did something nobody else had done quite the same way. They made a phone design that was easy for detractors to hate, but they owned it anyways, and the iPhone 10 proved to be the future in almost everything it did. The 10, for myself, is the peak of iPhone. There is no objective answer to the big question really, as stated much earlier, together, much of this just comes down to how we feel about something. The peak for me might be far different than the peak for you, and that's okay. The genuine excitement I felt when I unboxed the iPhone X could very well be also felt by others opening their new iPhone 16 Pro, and I really do hope that's the case. I hope there are people who are happy about the new iPhones releasing and are still hyped every year for whatever comes next, but I'm not. I'm not excited for the 16 Pro, 17 Pro, 18 Pro. It's not impossible for Apple to win me back, and odds are I will still keep using and buying new iPhones as time goes on. I purposely am releasing this video just before the iPhone 16 Pro announcement because while to some extent it might age poorly due to lacking reference to that new phone, I actually don't believe it's going to matter or make any difference whatsoever. The disheartening truth is nothing in this video will age poorly. Everything I've said will continue to apply because smartphones have mainly run out of headroom to grow and improve, because Apple isn't the same company they once were and lacks a true vision of how to morph the future. Instead, content to just release an absurdly expensive headset, then hope and pray people will actually buy it. I recently read Walter Isaacson's biography on Steve Jobs, and it was very enlightening. Jobs was an extremely flawed human, but there was no question he was a genius, and more relevantly, he always had a vision of what to do next. He had something people called a reality distortion field, where he truly could almost delusionally believe the impossible, somehow get his engineers to eventually believe it as well, and then, against all odds, make it happen. That's what the first iPhone was. That's what the iPod was, the Macintosh. Apple has gone from an underdog to practically a monopoly, embroiled in constant controversies, antitrust cases, and accusations of stifling competition. The company's focus has shifted from groundbreaking innovation to maximizing profit margins and maintaining its dominant market position. The magic that once defined Apple, the relentless pursuit of the one more thing, driven by the leadership of Jobs, seems to have faded. Instead of introducing revolutionary products with the power to change not just industries but society at large, Apple simply iterates on existing designs and technologies. The risk-taking, the audacious leaps into the unknown that characterize the Apple I've always loved has given way to corporate, calculated, incremental improvements. They do still make fantastic products, and I highly doubt that will ever change. There's a reason they've grown exponentially under Tim Cook and have remained incredibly successful financially. But the bold spirit that made the Apple logo an icon of innovation, the reality distortion field, believing the impossible was possible and then making it happen, that's long gone, or at least that's how it feels these days. Like the movie industry or gaming publishers making new sequels and reboots year after year, there's seemingly an inability to make something truly new. Because I don't consider the Vision Pro new. I don't consider it the future, certainly not at that price. And iPhone, while it absolutely does the job for now and will only continue to get incrementally better, without one more thing, it may one day no longer retain its relevance. The iPhone X, for one glorious, shining moment, broke this perception. Everything we know about the rushed launch proves to me that Apple is still capable of pushing themselves, and in turn the industry around them. The iPhone X, for as expensive and imperfect as it was, is the absolute peak of iPhone to my own evaluation. It once again gave people something new that they may not have imagined prior, but absolutely and immediately knew they wanted, if not needed. Or at least that's what the iPhone X was and is to me. Perhaps this all is an overly dramatic and excessive conclusion, but if you've gotten this far into the video, maybe you can relate. You don't have to be completely engulfed in the tech realm and smartphone world to see Apple hasn't done anything quite like the iPhone X since. And mind you, it's not as if we can expect an iPhone X every single year. As we went through the succeeding models, many of those phones were pretty great. They brought a lot of useful and intuitive features, making those essential refinements. But we are 7 years down the road. 7 years before the iPhone X, the iPhone 4 came out. Looking at the gap between those two phones, can you honestly say the same level of change has come from the iPhone X to the 16 Pro? There is something said in Walter Isaacson's book that really stood out to me and almost felt like foreshadowing for the future of Apple. Looking back on the CEO that had led to Steve Jobs' removal from Apple in 1985, Isaacson writes this: "For Jobs, the problem was that Scully never became a product person. He didn't make the effort or show the capacity to understand the fine points of what they were making. He wasn't naturally passionate about products, which was among the most damning sins that Jobs could imagine." Near the end of the book, Isaacson also wrote about Tim Cook, a modest man who didn't pursue credit, very unlike Steve Jobs, who always put his name on everything. In many ways, he was Jobs' mirror image. "I'm a good negotiator, but he's probably better than me because he's a cool customer," Jobs later said. After adding a bit more praise, he quietly added a reservation, one that was serious but rarely spoken. But Tim's not a product person, per se. The word iPhone immediately brings to mind an integral aspect of daily life that's permeated throughout society over nearly the past 2 decades. Everyone knows what an iPhone is, and unless there's another iPhone 10, everyone knows what an iPhone will always be.
This is a very complicated world. It's a very noisy world. And we're not going to get a chance to get people to remember much about us. No company is. And so we have to be really clear on what we want them to know about us. Now, Apple, fortunately, is one of the half a dozen best brands in the whole world. Right up there with Nike, Disney, Coke, Sony. It is one of the greats of the greats, not just in this country, but all around the globe. But even a great brand needs investment and caring if it's going to retain its relevance and vitality. And the way to do that is not to talk about speeds and feeds. It's not to talk about MIPS and megahertz. It's not to talk about why we're better than Windows. What we're about isn't making boxes for people to get their jobs done. We believe that people with passion can change the world for the better. That's what we believe.